Hi, I'm Jon Atack.
I'm Sam Atack.
And we are related.
Yes.
A few weeks ago, a young man in Australia, in Melbourne, Australia, called Andy Nolch, put up a video called Debunking Jon Atack. So we're responding to that. We hope to do so courteously and not to occasion too much mirth along the way.
No.
And I'm not going to be using the Australian accent at any point. Our theme for today is from Charles Dickens, the wonderful novel Great Expectations, which I'm ashamed to say is the only Charles Dickens novel I've read. But in there he says, take nothing on its looks. Take everything on evidence. Take nothing on its looks. Take everything on evidence. And we're going to be talking about something which I think is an essential aspect of understanding authoritarian groups and their followers, abusive relationships. And that is what William James, the founding father of psychology, called noesis. The idea becoming certain of a belief without having evidence. Feelings of knowing.
Shall I make the differentiation between inductive and deductive reasoning at this point?
I think, yeah, okay, go ahead.
Okay, so deductive, that's where you find something out based on evidence. Inductive is where you try and add stuff to your previous beliefs, which are not necessarily held on evidence. And then inductive you can separate into two, where you either take something on weak evidence because it agrees with something you previously believed, or you just make something up to justify some contradiction in your beliefs.
So you deduce something because you have the evidence in front of you,
Yes.
and you induce something because you have opinions or belief.
Yeah.
So deductive reasoning would be the basic method of science,
Yes.
scientific inquiry, which is, of course, science is not a belief system, contrary to, it's a method of inquiry. And inductive reasoning would be the method of sociology.
Yes.
Or evolutionary psychology,
Or Andy Nolch saying that you have been fed your information on Scientology from governmental agencies because he disagrees with you as a source.
yeah, so he does what's called an ad hominem attack.
Yeah.
Rather than refuting the evidence, you attack the source of the evidence. And so I'm hoping, maybe against hope, that Andy will see this and rethink his thinking and his way of thinking about things. But we are going to be extensive. He calls himself the Space Cowboy on his podcasts. And I went and looked that up. And in the Urban Dictionary it says, a space cowboy is a stoner, a pothead, somebody who constantly smokes marijuana. Also used as a noun, a cool, hip and slightly aloof individual who regularly gets super high and goes about his normal business constantly getting stoned. So that's how he identifies himself. I'm not sure if he has a different definition. That was the only one I could find, actually. I looked it up in several places. So this all started when an email found its way out of Spike's spam folder, and she called me up on a Saturday saying that it had been sat there for 3 weeks or something, and she was really sorry and I should get in touch with this guy. I was very busy editing the latest iteration of Opening Our Minds. Please go out and buy 10 copies immediately. We will be repeating that statement throughout the video. No, we won't. Yes, we will.
We will in the next videos.
Yeah, but you've got to really hit people with the thing. Repetition is
Yes, I've read it 3 times. Well, I've read it 2 times and had you read it to me 1 time.
That's true. He sat through me reading it out, and it will be...
It's great.
Will be available on Audible. Poor Spike, the work she's had to do.
Well, it wasn't easy for you reading it out.
No, it was awful, and I really hadn't expected it to be difficult at all. I thought it'd be great.
Yeah, but listening to you reading it out, that was great.
Oh, very too kind. So this email wandered in and basically asked, Andy said that he was no longer a Scientologist. We will get to the actual text a little bit later on. and that he wanted to close down his podcast with a final interview, and he thought I'd be the best person.
In fact, he said that you'd helped him become a non-Scientologist, that he'd read some of your stuff or watched some of it, and that had helped him become a non-Scientologist.
Yeah, and we'll actually read exactly the words that he used in a little while, in the not too far distant future. So I was very busy. I didn't check him out. And I am going to say that I would actually have done this anyway, if I had checked him out. So he wanted to interview me. We talked for a couple of hours. I said, well, I'll put it up on my channel, you put it up on your channel. And he hadn't got to the end of his questions. I'm really busy. So I slot in another couple of hours, and he does another interview, and he's still not finished. And this is all within a couple of weeks when I'm really busy. And so I had a third interview, and we pretty much, get to the end of it. My thoughts along the way was that I used to do interventions with Scientologists way back. I think the last one was 1995. And I basically came to a method that was successful with everybody I talked to, that they would reconsider their involvement with Scientology. And everyone who would talk to me decided they didn't want to continue with any kind of Scientology. So you can't actually go into an intervention with a camera and record it, not ethically. So this seemed a chance to do something, to put on record finally something of my approach in one part of an intervention. Normally the first part is to explain exploitative persuasion, guided imagination, and show how that works. And then the second part is to show material about Scientology that's contradictory, that upsets the claims made for Scientology. And then the third part is where I'm open to any questions. That was the part we did. So if anybody's interested in the way that I approached that, and it's very much an improvisation, because he asked me whatever questions he wanted. I didn't have anything.
And normally you'd have checked the background of the person you're doing an intervention on, but of course
thoroughly.
This is for a show.
Yeah.
And he said he was already not a Scientologist anymore.
And so I didn't need to find out anything about how to persuade him, what he believed in, or any of this. And on reflection, I would have done it whichever way. But what happened was we'd agreed to release the videos on a Saturday, and he put the first one up on a Thursday. He gazumped me, as we say, which is okay. And Tony Ortega sent me, my good friend, my compadre, Tony Ortega sent me a one-line email. Very succinct. He's a great journalist, he doesn't waffle like I do, he gets to the point. And he said, do you know what Andy Nolch went to prison for? And the truth is I didn't. So I went and looked, and that led me to do another interview, which Andy has also put up, where I asked him about various allegations that he's a misogynist, that he's a neo-Nazi, and to look at and a drug user. And I wanted to look at these things and ask him about it. So to go to those things, he was arrested after spray painting a large phallus on the grass in a park where a memorial was going to be held for a young comedian called Eurydice Dixon, who had been attacked, raped and murdered not very long before. A meeting was going to be held by a feminist group, and Andy is anti-feminist. His line would be not all men, not everyone. That's a line I've seen him use. So he, in the early hours of the morning, sprayed this, and I asked him about it and said, it was half the size of a cricket pitch in a news report. He agreed to that. Cricket pitch is 22 yards, I believe. So this was an 11-yard penis and testes spray painted. It was covered with tarpaulin. The memorial didn't turn out to be a political feminist meeting because Eurydice Dixon's father parents asked that it should not be, and so they respected that and just had a memorial. Andy Nolch was arrested. He was sentenced to, I believe, 200 hours of community service, ordered to pay quite a sizable amount of money to repair the turf, and that was that. He told me that he'd got, I think, 180 hours into his community service, and he was arrested on his way back into Australia, I think from Indonesia, where he'd bought a substance called hermine. This is a fungus which is used to mitigate the fairly drastic digestive effects of the drug ayahuasca. So he'd got 7 times the legal limit of this substance. He was arrested, the court was notified, and he was taken to court because basically, under the court order for his community service, he couldn't leave the country without permission, and he'd been out of the country twice. So he was then sentenced to 5 months in prison, and he served 4 months. This is I think there's a video called Graffiti.
No.
Well, it's an Andy Nolch video. We will put a link. But
Yeah.
this is from the transcript, YouTube transcript from Andy Nolch, if you'd like to read out what his opinion now is of what happened to Eurydice Dixon, who was raped and murdered.
I'm 60% sure this is what happened. She said this joke and annoyed this autistic person, and she basically triggered him, and after the show he hunted her down and killed her. She had an aggressive personality, so it takes 2 to tango. I don't think he just instantly killed her. I think that there would have been much more of a battle, and she contributed to it. I've seen many confrontations in life. When someone doesn't approach it like a peaceful Buddhist Jesus type person, they flare up the other person, and so this is why I don't really get into any fights, because I'm just way too chilled.
All right, and that's that. So, in his opinion, Eurydice Dixon should have just been a Jesus Buddha type like Andy himself, and been chilled about being attacked and raped. That's despicable.
Yeah.
Okay, let's look at the actual debunking of Jon Atack.
Yes.
He starts all of his videos with
Yeah.
this statement, which is actually L. Ron Hubbard saying this.
Scientology could be called, well, you could call it a religion of religions.
You could, but it isn't. And he then tells us that that what he's doing on YouTube are closed-door secret briefings.
Yes, he's closed all the doors and he hasn't told anybody about it.
Yeah, and they're not closed doors. They're not secret. You can't put it somewhere on. So there's a little bit of contradiction already. He then says, "I'm your host, Andy Nolch, Space Cowboy, and today's briefing is a debunking of Jon Atack, the Scientology hater." If you'd like to.
He quickied a lot of his stuff and he didn't quite do it very thoroughly.
So that's about the 9 years that I spent in Scientology, that a quickie is where you do a process too fast to get through it. His comment comes entirely from what I said about spending 3 days on OT3, on the one advanced level. The rest of Scientology I did at a regular pace, just to clarify that. And I had 9 years in there, you know.
Yeah.
So here he says,
From the top.
the red stuff.
Yeah. I'm only half a Scientologist. She said he was only half a Scientologist when you interviewed him. If he'd done a good job...
At the moment, I'm only half a Scientologist.
At the moment, I'm only half a Scientologist. If he'd done a good job of convincing me that Scientology is bad, I would have said, that's it, I'm having nothing to do with Scientology. Like, I was shaky as to even if I'm 50% Scientologist.
So that's what he's saying now. This is what he said on the 16th of February, 2021. These are his words, if you could read those.
I'm very interested in interviewing Jon Atack for my Independent Scientology podcast. I was a Scientologist inside and outside the church for around 4 years each. Now I am a non-believer. Jon helped wake me up to the truth about Scientology. I host a podcast about independent Scientology, and I am about to stop making it as I'm no longer a Scientologist. Would Jon like to be my very last interview?
He also said in that email that he loved my stuff and that's what had got him to stop believing. So he came to me as somebody who no longer believed. He now says I didn't convince him.
Back then I was just like, no, I don't know.
Yeah. So in fact he made a positive statement that yes, he did know that he was no longer a Scientologist. Yeah, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
So he then says...
skeptics are just wrong about things.
Yeah, and he accused me of being a skeptic, whatever that is.
Yeah.
So we have a definition.
One who instinctively or habitually doubts, questions or disagrees with assertions or generally accepted conclusions. That's the American Heritage Dictionary.
Yep.
One who doubts the validity of what claims to be knowledge in some particular department of inquiry. For example, metaphysics, theology, natural science, etc. And that's the OED.
Oxford English Dictionary. So, by those terms, yes, I admit to being a skeptic. I do habitually doubt, question, disagree with assertions and generally accepted conclusions. I doubt the validity of material that claims to be knowledge, and I believe it should be tested. I believe to do otherwise is to be a dupe, to be credulous, to be gullible. We should check things, and I encourage people, as I have with my children, to question things. With my kids, right from my oldest on through, I have 4 children. With that great good luck. I have encouraged them all to challenge my authority, to question me, and sadly, they have at times proved me wrong.
Ah,
so
goodness.
I've changed my mind about that now. Do as you're told.
Slap.
I think we should question. I think we should test. And he then tells us about skeptics,
yeah.
and he's made a confusion here. I think he's confusing skeptic with a capital S, a member of the Skeptics Society. I've never belonged to the Skeptics Society. I gave 2 talks to the skeptics in the early 1990s. But that's, I'm not a member of the Skeptics Society.
Yeah. So I'll read it again. Skeptics are just wrong about things. They're wrong about psychic abilities. They're wrong about aliens. They're wrong about government conspiracies and stuff.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that Ron Hubbard said about antisocial personalities is they trade in generalities. So suddenly I'm labelled as a skeptic. I am sceptical, but I'm not a member of the Skeptics Society. To presume that all people who are sceptical don't believe in these things. I mean, when I spoke to the Skeptics Society at South Ethical Place in London, which is where Rossetti and William Morris used to lecture, wow. One of them said to me that he was sceptical about hypnosis, and that you can be sceptical about anything. I've seen guided imagination, or what people call hypnosis, used throughout Scientology to get people to believe all sorts of strange things. So I do believe that hypnosis exists.
Yes.
What the mechanisms involved in it are is a little more complicated. I also would like to say, don't believe in psychic abilities, not seen any evidence, like to see evidence. Had plenty of time. Scientology's had 40-something years now to convince me. It's nearly 47 years.
And you used the tinsel test.
And I have used the tinsel test many times.
Let's use the mints instead of...
Well, it's a bit hard retroactively for people to
yes.
do this, but if you really do have superpowers. I used to put a little bit of tin foil on the table in front of me if I was talking and say that, if there are any Scientology operating thetans watching, that if they could just move the bit of tin foil a centimetre or an inch, I didn't mind what kind of measure they used, it could be metric or imperial, then that would be a proof of their psychic abilities. I'd heard enough of them say that they were moving clouds or changing traffic lights,
Yes.
or what the South Africans call robots. But I've never, and sorry, it's been there all these years. As yet, I have never seen a psychic ability demonstrated, and having somebody write about it is not enough for me. I'd need to witness it. They're wrong about aliens. I don't know what skeptics are wrong about in terms of aliens. Are there alien life forms? Yes. Do I believe that inevitably, in a universe of this size, there are inevitably other inhabited planets? Are they capable of reaching our planet? Well, not according to our contemporary scientific theory, because they'd need to travel at speeds that would spaghettify them, and that is the technical term. Or they'd need to be able to travel through wormholes in space,
If we could prove that wormholes.
if such things existed.
Yeah.
So, yes, there are aliens. No, I don't believe they're among us. And I've not seen any evidence, and I've looked at a fair amount, that I find persuasive, because the evidence I have looked at is conflicting. So, yeah, that's another topic altogether. But if you look at the guy who faked the autopsy of the aliens, a friend of mine actually was the producer, before I met him, of a wonderful little documentary where they go and interview the butcher who provided the bones that were used in the autopsy of the aliens. It's that pathetic. Skeptics are wrong about government conspiracies. Well, from my point of view, governments are always engaging in conspiracies. The overthrow of foreign states, sadly a commonplace of US policy since 1945, for example, Honduras or Iran, but they're among, I believe there have been 80 attempts to overthrow states, and 42 of them, would be 42, have been successful. And they've tended to replace democratic governments, as in Honduras and Iran, with dictatorships. And that's through conspiracy that's occurred.
Pretending that they'd found nuclear weapons.
Which is part of the deception that's within, so the invasion of Iraq, when the weapons inspector, Hans Blick, something like that, when he'd said, absolutely not. They said, yes, that's what it is. And we later found out that it was just two defectors from Iraq who didn't have any real information, had managed to persuade the intelligence agencies of Europe and America that such weapons existed. I believe at the time the foreign minister of Iraq was an American agent, so they had somebody rather higher up who could have told them the truth. So yes, governments do conspire. Just to clarify that point. If we want to go on.
And we'll see the conspiracies he believes in, government conspiracies he believes in later on.
There's lots of good fun coming up, promise it.
Yes. After finding out about him, it made me put him into the category of being an unreliable source of information.
Now, he repeats that a dozen times. I'm a faulty calculator, and it becomes tedious listening to the repetition. As the joke we made at the beginning about that we would be mentioning opening our minds every few minutes and saying, go out and buy 10 copies. But that wasn't, in fact, true. We won't be repeating that.
Yes.
It's about the repetition principle.
Yes, but he's a space cowboy. So
he is a space cowboy, and when you're stoned, it's hard to tell whether you're Jesus or Buddha.
Yeah.
And here we have.
I've written down all the points why I don't think he's reliable.
And he then, in an hour and 20 minutes, as I say, I believe, gives just 3 examples, all the points. So, one example.
One example, he would say something like, Trump's a terrible person, or something. And that's just not true. Trump is an awesome guy. He's just a good guy. There's nothing wrong with him. Every country needs a president like Trump.
Okay, so this is comparing apples with oranges, isn't it? That because I have a low opinion of Donald John Trump, based upon a lot of research, tens of hours of video, much of it, with his friends. The Bandy Lee's wonderful book, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, that the evidence is that, without getting too deeply into it, his father, Fred Trump, was a cohort of mafia gangsters who basically ripped people off blind in the building trade. He started out with the Commodore. He managed to get a remarkable tax break from the corrupt New York mayor to refurbish a building for rich people with money that was meant to be helping the poor. So,
who was one of the lead builders in the documentary we watched, who said he'd just try and use the cheapest possible materials?
The woman who was the project coordinator for Trump Towers said that while she still admires the building, and I do, I think it's quite a good looking building, she said that all material on the inside was absolutely the cheapest you could get.
Yeah.
And these apartments are sold for millions. He then goes on to start up 3 casinos in Atlantic City. And writes The Art of the Deal, or doesn't in fact write The Art of the Deal. A man called Tony Schwartz writes The Art of the Deal. And he's claiming to be this fantastic businessman. And you go, here's the first principle of business. I've established a casino in Atlantic City. Let me put 2 more there so I can compete with myself.
Yes.
He did get to the point where he had, I believe, the largest owning casino in the world. $1 million a day was coming through there. But it still didn't pay the interest on the money he'd borrowed to run it.
Yes.
And he himself had almost nothing to do with running it. I've seen interviews with the people who did. So, not a great businessman, bankrupted along the way, all sorts of scandals beyond that. So, but this is completely irrelevant. It's the evidence about Scientology that's relevant, not what my opinions are about any political figure, past or future. So this is a confusion of evidence by having too broad a remit. This is irrelevant, what I think about Trump. And he says,
I'd read his book about money.
He'd written 15 years ago. This is The Art of the Deal, which, as I say, was written by Tony Schwartz. Tony Schwartz, in the piece he wrote for Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, which is largely a psychiatric analysis of Trump, points out that in one of his private conversations, Trump said to him, people are either predators or prey. And I'd like to thoroughly disagree with that. That's a psychopathic notion of the world. You don't have to be a predator and you don't have to be prey.
Yeah, you can be a collaborator.
Yeah, you can be a decent, cooperative person.
Yeah.
And indeed, it's the predator-prey model that will always spoil society and cause authoritarian belief.
Though, of course, Trump wants to help humanity, according to Andy Nolch. There are predators and there are prey. But,
yeah.
There's all these things that I've fact-checked that he's wrong about.
As I say, there are only 3 points that he makes in the whole video.
He's like a faulty calculator.
Which, of course, is the Dianetics Modern Science and Mental Health comparison, that you have a held-down 7 or a held-down 5, depending which part of and that will go into all of your calculations.
I've written down many things.
But he decided not to share them with us.
He sees a hat and he calls it an orange.
Which is something he actually says 3 times through the video. He sees a hat and he calls it an orange. Okay, we haven't got a hat in the room, sadly, but we'll presume your good faith and accepting that I can tell the difference between a hat and an orange, and we'll move on.
Okay, what would a hat look like?
It's something you put on your head.
And what colour is orange?
Ooh, that's a difficult one.
And what are the oranges of this?
What are the oranges of this? What are the oranges of this?
He said that Hubbard offered brainwashing tactic to Kennedy.
Yeah, that's the first of his 3 points. The simple point, and we'll probably get into this in far too elaborate detail, is I did indeed say that L. Ron Hubbard had written a letter to Kennedy in which he offered brainwashing technology. And I was wrong. Okay? One of the things about evidence-based belief is that you can change your mind and you can find out that there was something wrong in the evidence. But what was wrong in the evidence is quite simple. The letter that Hubbard wrote offered conditioning.
Yes.
So it's all in a matter of if you could explain the difference between conditioning and brainwashing. He also, we've got the detail here, but he also wrote a letter to the FBI in which he said he'd sent his brainwashing materials to the Defense Department.
Yeah. And this is the one point that...
Yeah, Hubbard also said we can brainwash faster than the Russians, 20 seconds to total amnesia. He also said in his private affirmations, which are statements you repeat to yourself, men are your slaves. And in a 1952 lecture, the 20th lecture of the Philadelphia doctorate course, he says, we have ways of making slaves here. Further on in this statement, Andy Nolch says that I was brainwashed by Scientology. So brainwashing is, I'm not sure what the problem is here and why that would change our opinion of anything else that I've reported about Scientology.
He just exaggerates things.
Again and again, he will, keep repeating this idea. Just keep going till you hit red.
Yeah. I made a note of some of the outrageous things that he said.
But he doesn't share a single one of them with us.
He was one of the most passive-aggressive people. He's got a lot of anger there, smiles a lot. That's not a smile.
Oh, sorry.
Like compulsively smiles. You do compulsively smile. But you do it because you're trying to hide your anger. He's trying to hide his anger.
So on that point, I've been a smiley sort of chap since I was born. It's often been noted I smile a lot.
Yeah.
And I'd like to apologise to Andy for doing that.
Yes, we're going to try the stoical thing now.
He goes on and talks about my very good friend Chris Shelton. Chris and I have done more than 20 shows together.
Chris Shelton knows that he's passive-aggressive.
So I went to Chris Shelton, forgive me for being trivial. I said, hey Chris, Andy Nolch says I'm passive-aggressive and that I'm passive-aggressive. And I got a response. I told him I'd be quietly furious if he disagreed with me.
Yes, you'd come around and beat him up or something.
No, quietly furious. Passive-aggressive. You don't beat people up.
But so passive-aggressive that he'd be frightened not to say that.
Yeah, I sort of...
You do it very well.
Thank you. So Chris came straight back and he said, no, you're not passive-aggressive. I used to live in Minnesota. I know what passive-aggressive looks like. And just in case anybody thinks this is because I gave him money, he did then venture a criticism of my behaviour.
Yes, you...
he said that I gish-gallop.
Gish-gallop, that's beautiful.
Which is just a lovely expression, which basically means I'm garrulous.
Yes.
I talk a lot.
You gish-gallop garrulously.
It's true. I do talk a lot. But I don't, unlike Andy Nolch, I don't say the same thing over and over again. I am actually trying to add information, and it could be a psychological thing with me that I like to finish things.
I mean, you should see him off camera. He can do it for 10 hours then, when we're not recording him. So I don't think he does gish gallop in front of the camera. Compared to what he does in private.
I like talking, I like listening.
Yeah, I like listening to
you. I've never had a 10-hour uninterrupted statement, not as yet. We'll try that.
We'll go for it.
But I like, what will often happen in a conversation is that somebody will interject something. I've not quite finished what I'm saying. I'll pick up that point, then there'll be another interjection, and it's just a habit of mind, and it might be indicative of a relation to Asperger's syndrome, which I do not have, but I also systematise, which is another aspect of it. I also have an unusually good memory, so I have characteristics, and one of them is liking to finish a point, and I think that can be awful sometimes for the listener, but when my good friend Bonnie Woods, who worked with me for 3 years fairly intensively, when it was said to her that somebody had said that I talked too much, she said I was the best listener she'd ever met.
Yes, absolutely. That's true. And I've known garrulous talkers who could put you to sleep through their talking, whereas your stuff's very interesting.
Thank you. Most kind. And what about angry? Now, you've known me for 19 years. How many outbursts of anger have you seen in that time? How many people have I hit?
Oh, none.
None. Do I shout?
No.
No. Do you get the impression that I'm angry, that I'm a passive-aggressive, angry person?
No, not at all.
No. So
you get the impression that if you were an angry person, you could be very intimidating. But
I'm just mildly intimidating at the moment.
At the moment. Yeah.
I bash people with...
You don't need to get angry. Or angly. Sorry.
Though, unlike Andy Nolch, I cannot claim to be a Jesus Buddha, chilled out sort of person. I do get annoyed.
Yeah, if I slapped you right now, you'd probably...
I will retaliate, I warn you. I'm a pacifist, but if anybody comes at me or my children...
So if I slap myself...
Yeah, I'll beat you up for doing that. So, passive-aggressive. Now, and let's pick up on this point. I do, about 8 hours of interviews with the guy. All he had to do was come to me and say, look, I've written this list of things that I'm not happy about, let's talk about it. Instead of which he issues a video in a secret closed-door YouTube. And on.
He's definitely is arrogant, passive-aggressive.
So I'm not just passive-aggressive, I'm arrogant.
Yes. Jon Atack believes in vaccines and global warming. So that's just ridiculous. I mean, the world where we still have polar caps, if you go down to the beach, the water is still at the same level.
Right, so again, this is a difference of category, that he's criticising the accuracy of my work on Scientology. And because I am assured that vaccines work, because I do indeed believe that global warming is taking place, I can't be trusted. Which is to say, if you don't believe what I believe, I'm not going to consider your evidence. So, on vaccines, I'm currently actually finishing a book by Brian Deere called The Doctor Who Fooled the World, which is about Andrew Wakefield, who was formerly a doctor until he was struck off by the General Medical Council. This book goes into tremendous detail. Deere was the journalist who researched Wakefield over a period of years, and indeed he was asked by the General Medical Council to be present. And in short, what happened is that Andrew Wakefield was a mid-level gastroenterologist who had no patients and was working at the Royal Free Hospital in London. He went to a lawyer called Barr and set up the provisions for a court case, a class action, where the parents of children with autism would sue because their children had been infected by measles by being given the measles, mumps, rubella vaccination before he had a single case. He'd gone to a lawyer. They raised £55,000 from the Legal Aid Board by deceptive means, as they didn't actually have any evidence. He then did a study of 12 children. That study has been rejected because it was faked. The lab equipment that was used at Coombe Hospital in Ireland was not properly run, and this has been taken apart in court cases in this country and in the US. Wakefield sued Brian Deere. He dropped the suit in the UK, in England, before proceeding. And the court held that it seemed that the suit was filed to try and silence the journalist. And I believe he lost the case in the US. There is no doubt that his work is false. It is not supported in the medical community at all. And Brian Deere, so I would ask this one thing, Andy. Read Brian Deere's book and then send me the evidence that you have that supports your idea. But I'd also like to say, Andrew Wakefield has become the centre of the anti-vax movement. But Andrew Wakefield already filed patents for his own measles vaccine. So he is not an anti-vaxxer. He was actually trying to get in. He made hundreds of thousands of pounds from the cases that were brought because he was paid as a consultant. He is a charlatan. I'd also suggest that anybody who is an anti-vaxxer looks at the period of the 1870s when smallpox was rampant. There was a massive anti-vaxxing movement. 7 states in the US were forced out of compulsory vaccination laws. The compulsory vaccination law was dropped in Great Britain, and the term conscientious objector was used for the first time in law, not for somebody who didn't want to fight, but for somebody who didn't want their children to be vaccinated. If you look in particular at the 1874 outbreak in Sweden, where for some reason 90% of the population outside of Stockholm were vaccinated, but only 40% of the Stockholm population, because they'd probably got their own Andrew Wakefield. There were priests and doctors at that time who formed huge anti-vaccine movements. In Leicester, just up the road from here, 100,000 people met to protest compulsory vaccination in the 1870s. If you look at what happened in Stockholm, it gives you a pretty good indication that vaccination was very safe and very necessary. So if we move on, sorry.
Andrew Wakefield was offered the opportunity to have a gold standard study done.
That's correct. The Royal Free Hospital, a new head of the hospital came in, and one of his 25 conditions for taking over, having reviewed Wakefield's work, was that Wakefield should be sacked. So they offered Wakefield the choice between basically having a year's salary and going away, or having a complete gold standard test done of his findings. He declined the offer. So he's a charlatan. Global warming, oh come on. We're going to go down to the beach and see the water level, and that's going to overrule the evidence of thousands of weather stations. The photographic evidence from Greenland, which is where most icebergs are birthed, where the glaciers are melting. They're melting in the Himalaya. The polar ice cap, the North Pole, has been melting, and we are now seeing a melt in the South Pole. That's just an aspect of it. We're dealing with a situation where more than 97% of the scientists who deal with climate science agree. You'll never get that level of agreement, no matter how many government conspiracies you believe in, about anything. Even in mathematics, there isn't a 97% agreement about the three different schools that exist. So to find that consensus among tens of thousands of people who have studied the evidence, the ice cores and temperature variations that we can see, the hockey sticks.
And of course, disagreement would be subject to scientific testing.
Yeah, and has been. There's been a great deal of argument about it. So, but again, it's irrelevant. What I believe in is what I say about Ron Hubbard and Scientology true? And if you go down to the beach, you'll find out that it is.
Good. Shall I read that?
Yeah.
There's all these kids that have gotten autism from vaccines.
Right. Well, firstly, we're talking about regressive autism, not classical autism. So classical autism you're born with, very sadly. Regressive autism, a child develops to a certain level, for example, starting to speak, and then they lose that development. That's called regressive autism, and that's what Andrew Wakefield said he believed was caused by the MMR vaccine. He was still advocating the use of a measles vaccine of his own devising, remember, and at a cost of, this guy kept registering companies all over the place he even tried to patent the microwave oven as a scientific instrument along the way. Quite a guy. So there is no supporting evidence. There is, I feel this is right, therefore it's true, or I checked the evidence and it isn't. So please, Andy, Brian Deere, The Doctor Who Fooled the World, read it and see how you feel at the end of it.
And again, he was offered the opportunity to do a gold standard study.
And he refused.
Yeah.
So, and he's made loads of money ever since in America. He was at Donald J. Trump's inauguration because a couple of months before Trump had tweeted that he was sure that autism, not regressive autism, that autism was caused by vaccines.
Yes.
No evidence.
There's all these people that are dying from the COVID vaccine. I've had a vaccine.
Yeah,
I'm dying.
I've had two. One of my friends died from COVID-19. One of my daughter-in-law's relatives died from it. To fake deaths now in the millions, you'd need a heck of a government control because we've got the internet.
Yeah. And
we're talking about reports that are coming from all over the world. as to people dying from the COVID vaccine, I haven't seen any evidence of that. And at the moment in the UK, we've had 129,000 deaths here, and not from the COVID vaccine, from COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2. Yeah, been through it carefully.
I was just thinking to later when he says that he ignored the COVID rules in his workplace.
Yeah.
Putting lives in
Yeah.
danger. Anyway, like a lot of us, when we got involved with Scientology and got brainwashed,
he's like a lot of us when we got in Scientology. So he is saying that Scientology is brainwashing, and his first complaint is that I say that Hubbard said that Scientology is brainwashing, which he did.
Yeah.
So,
and he's saying that because that's what happened with you. You've been not only brainwashed by Scientology, but you've been brainwashed and sucked in by the Western mainstream society.
So, but as a skeptic, of course, that would be difficult.
Yes.
It's only people who are not skeptical that get sucked in easily by such ideas.
He's still in the cult of the Western society.
Not really. A cult is a group that has a focus on a particular individual or doctrine, by the way, by definition, in the Oxford Dictionary. And I have been protesting Western society since childhood. I have always been a sore thumb. I've always disagreed with politicians. I've been very vocal about this. So I am in no way in the cult of Western society. Indeed, at the moment, I'm researching material about the intelligence agencies, which I don't know if I'll use it, but I basically believe that the intelligence agencies are the most dangerous cults in the world. They've caused more damage than any other group. And we then go back to groups like the Nazis and the Bolsheviks, who, because of their belief systems, because of their cult of personality, caused tremendous danger. I'm not one of these people, Andy.
No. He just hasn't woken up. I think he's got cognitive dissonance. I'll take this.
Cognitive dissonance.
Cognitive dissonance. Can we use the word cognitive assonance here? Cognitive dissonance is not a problem. It's cognitive assonance where you then take that disagreement and resolve it to something that agrees with your previous opinions.
And I am the inventor of cognitive assonance.
So again, you are. Yes.
I patented it.
Yes. I like it. So when he later says that you're being fed information by the government on Scientology, that's definitely cognitive assonance, because he's not quite sure of you, so he's using false information or made up information to resolve himself to something that already agrees with him, rather than properly checking the evidence, like reading the reference notes and seeing that half of them are quotes from Hubbard and in Blue Sky.
And I did write to him and suggest some of my papers. I was shocked to find out that he'd said, he loved my stuff and it had got him out, that he hadn't read Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky, because everything else is commentary. That and the Getting Clear conference and the papers. Hubbard, the only one he said he wanted to read was Hubbard and the Occult. Everybody wants to know about the black magic. But Scientology, Religion or Intelligence Agency, Possible Origins for Dianetics and Scientology, and my personal favourite, Never Believe a Hypnotist, which is a quotation from L. Ron Hubbard, by the way.
Wait. Yeah, there's a quote about raping women, right?
In 1949, writing from Savannah, Georgia, and you can find this letter on Tony Ortega's Underground Bunker, Hubbard wrote to his literary agent, Forry Ackerman. I had all of the Ackerman letters, along with quite a lot of other stuff. And he wrote and said that he discovered a technique whereby you could rape women and they wouldn't know anything about it. Yeah. That technique was Dianetics. And thankfully it's not true.
Yes.
But at the time it shows he was not actually using the method that's in Dianetics. Yes. He was using deep trance hypnosis. And
if they just lied down and let it happen,
then Jesus and Buddha would have left them alone.
Yeah.
On cognitive dissonance is a good thing. And I welcome it. That when somebody challenges my view and it makes me, as Andy has here, and it makes me have to think about it and justify and give evidence, then that's good. Cognitive dissonance is a bad thing, as Sam says, when it turns to cognitive assonance, where you're saying, well, what I already believe is true. And as Leon Festinger said when he gave us the term cognitive dissonance, the most researched element of psychology to date, I have read. Thousands of experiments confirm it. That when somebody strongly believes something, then it doesn't matter how good your evidence is, it will actually make their belief stronger. And that his test case was a woman who was actually a Scientologist. This is back in the 1950s. She had her own live-in Scientology auditor, and she channeled messages from an extraterrestrial being called Satananda, or
Nice.
Satnav, as I like to think of him, and which said that the mothership was going to come and take her and her followers off a hilltop. And what Festinger predicted, and he put a couple of his people into her group, was that those that went to the hillside would believe more strongly afterwards. Those that didn't would fall away. We're seeing this with QAnon at the moment, that the core believers still absolutely rigidly and vociferously believe in this abject nonsense, Q nonsense, QAnonsense, sorry.
Yes.
Didn't get my punchline out there. But most of the 3 million Facebook followers have now gone on to chase contrails or chemtrails or
So
flat Earth.
we
or-
predict that this, if Nolch watches this video, it will make him believe what he believes more strongly, and that he'll probably do some sort of ad hominem.
It'll be like
in
Jon Atack's
response,
super faulty calculator.
and super passive aggressive.
Yeah, we weren't going to do the Australian accent though.
Ah, yeah. That's all right. I didn't even notice. Yeah, should we? He talked about the world's #1 clear, which was, I can't do John McMaster in an Australian voice. John McMaster, and I think he said he was a horrible person or something.
I've taken careful notes or something.
I can't do anything with that because he said Trump was a horrible person. Trump was freaking awesome.
Trump was freaking awesome. World's #1 clear, all right. The world's first real clear, according to Aaron Hubbard in 1965, was John McMaster. I interviewed John for 3 hours on 2 occasions, so I have 6 hours of interviews with him. I didn't say he was a horrible person or something. I suggested that he was not clear and that he was an alcoholic. And I have no doubt of that. I met him on several occasions. So because he doesn't like Trump, I can't believe anything he says. Here we are again. This is not really rational. We then get into George Orwell, and he says he didn't like 1984 that much. Now, what I said to him was that, and I've been recommending 1984. In fact, in my book, Opening Our Minds,
You recommend, yes.
Yes, that's
if you'd read it.
Go and buy 10 copies.
Yes, and 10 copies for your neighbour.
Yeah, and everybody you know.
And everybody you know.
No,
And 10 copies for us as well.
yeah, we'd like that. Opening Our Minds actually does recommend, and it was republished last week, recommends 1984. I've recommended it to many people. Robert Vaughan Young, who announced Hubbard's death, was the top of Scientology PR in the US. He thanked me for recommending the book and said that it was the very model of the Sea Organisation, that it described the Sea Organisation. And so what I was saying is it's his last book, published in 1948, which is why the 8 and the 4 were reversed to make 84. That's the significance of the number. He wasn't actually predicting it, and it didn't actually come true. But it's his last book. He was very ill by this time. He was nigh unto death, and a very heavy smoker who had tuberculosis. Not a good idea. It's a very difficult period for him, and the book is not well finished. It's not as well written. That was my only criticism. Indeed, the appendix to 1984 I recommend, as did Margaret Singer, above almost anything else in terms of understanding how language can be used to trick people into believing things or to exclude them from understanding things.
Or, thought crime is induced by the cult of confession, as Lifton would put it. groups that make you confess things and constantly check your own thought, which was definitely done by the Chinese communist system.
Absolutely. The self-criticism method devised by Mao Zedong, or hot seat, as it's now sometimes called, is a deplorable method of breaking an individual down so you can control them.
And we have a video on that, which we presumably talk about.
We have presumably talked about
1984.
So, what I was saying was, I actually did count before doing this video. I've read 12 of George Orwell's books, and I hold to what I said. 1984 is clumsy in comparison to Coming Up for Air, Keep the Aspidistra Flying, Down and Out in Paris and London, Animal Farm, his various books of essays. And in one of those essays, he says, this is an essay called Why I Write, every line of serious work that I've written since 1936 has been written directly or indirectly against totalitarianism, a word that was invented shortly before 1936 and applied to Mussolini, and it's a portmanteau word. It collapses the word total and the word authoritarian, totalitarian or totalist. So that was Orwell's, every line of serious work from 1936 to his death, which I believe was at the beginning of 1950, directly or indirectly against totalitarianism. So he goes on to say it's probably the best book ever written, and he then goes on to say
he was an intelligence officer.
George Orwell. Well, that's not true. In 1949, shortly before he died, George Orwell prepared a list of notable writers and other persons he considered to be unsuitable as possible writers for the anti-communist propaganda activities of the Information Research Department, a secret propaganda organisation of the British state under the Foreign Office. That was his only involvement that I've been able to find. So he wasn't an intelligence officer, but he did spy on his friends. This becomes invidious, and there's been a lot of argument about it, because, for example, he not only said that Stephen Spender, the poet, would not be suitable as a writer, he informed this intelligence agency that he was gay, which was a criminal behaviour at the time, considered criminal.
And in 1984, it ends with the main character's trust of the female main characters. Her trust of her being completely broken, that you can no longer trust anybody after you've been tortured, which seems to be what he's doing to his own friends.
Seems to, he's basically informing, he's grassing up his friends, and unlike Andy Nolch, I'm not going to say, well, he did that, so therefore nothing he said is worthy. Everything he said is worthy. Animal Farm, 1984,
right.
The famous Politics in the English Language, which all journalists read, although it says to use the shortest word,
yes,
which Churchill also said, and you should use the word that is the commonest word if you want to get over. So rather than saying a jot, a tittle, a mote, or an iota, which are all pretty short words, you'd say a particle. So
if you were my wife, I'd drink it. Sorry.
Yes, that one goes backwards, doesn't mean you have to tell the joke.
Now we have to tell the joke.
Churchill was at a dinner party, and a woman turned to him and said, if you were my husband, I would put poison in your coffee. To which Churchill replied, and if I was your husband, I'd drink it. Which is, he was a funny old boy. So, not an intelligence officer. It says it's well written, it's perfectly written, it's fantastically written. I was comparing it to other books. It's an opinion. It's completely irrelevant to what I say about Scientology. Let's not bother with that.
You worked at the BBC.
Yeah, George Orwell worked at the BBC.
The Ministry of Truth, the government propaganda place. He knew the shifty stuff they were doing.
Yeah, and he worked at the Ministry of Truth. That's amusing, because the Ministry of Truth, of course, is in 1984. It's not a part of the British government establishment. Mini-Truth. So he's got a little bit of a confusion there. He did give a few talks on BBC Radio. That's true.
But the idea that the BBC was government propaganda.
Well, to some extent that could be said, because during wartime, of course, the government has an influence.
Yes, yeah.
But he was, you can read his broadcasts. They're nothing about intelligence. There's a book called The War Broadcasts. So, and he was only there for a short time. His wife did briefly work in censorship, which is an intelligence activity, and gets us confused with L. Ron Hubbard later on. But we've got the material about that when we come to it.
Yeah, Nolch is basically saying that he's doing it to criticise the English government rather than just totalitarianism. So
yeah, he seems to think that 1984 was written about the British government. It's not clear, but it's, of course, just as with Animal Farm, it's written about Stalin's Russia.
Yep.
And Orwell was a lapsed communist. He was somebody who had believed in the communist cause, then went and fought in Spain and wrote the book Homage to Catalonia about that, and changed his mind gradually so that he became more kind of centre socialist, member of the Labour Party.
Right. Here's a self-defeating statement, which is, you can't criticise 1984.
Yeah, he tells us that we're not allowed to criticise 1984. I don't think George Orwell would have approved of that sentiment. And there's something interesting here. I have often, recommended 1984, but alongside it I recommend Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, which was published in 1932, so before the Second War. And Huxley, I think in 1954, somewhere there, wrote a book called Brave New World Revisited. So I would recommend, Andy, that you read Brave New World, because that gives you the model that's actually going on in the world. 1984, the repressive authoritarian state, that collapsed in the USSR. I hope it will collapse in China as well. I hope that authoritarianism collapses all around the world, fascism as I tend to label it. And that democracy will be a possibility for future generations. But I would strongly recommend reading Brave New World Revisited after reading Brave New World. They're easy books to read, well written, better written than 1984, in my opinion. Huxley compares the two models and crows a little bit, basically saying, you see now that 1984 is not what we have to fear. It's Brave New World, where people are happy taking their Soma or Prozac or whichever drug we want to name it, and don't rebel against the state. George Lucas's THX 1138, his first movie, Ira Levin's, what's it called, Ira Levin's novel about a dystopian novel.
Oh, This Perfect Day.
This Perfect Day. Also well worth reading, but there's plenty of it. Okay. You also said that
Hubbard didn't write any of his books.
I didn't say that. I said Hubbard wrote Dianetics, the Modern Science of Mental Health, but thereafter Science of Survival and the following two books were ghost-written by Richard DeMille. Scientology 8.80 was ghostwritten by Althea Hart. There's a credit to him in it. Thereafter, every book was compiled by John Sanborn from 1954 to 1978. But if you look at the books, most of them admit to being compilations of lectures or extracts. So Fundamentals of Thought, A New Slant on Life, Problems of Work, 8.80, 8008, 0.8, Phoenix Lectures, Notes on the Lectures. From the titles you get, somebody else has put these things together. And when you get the earlier editions, and I do have many of the earlier editions, that person will be named. So Althea Hart, Richard DeMille. So my point was, even when you got to Mission Earth, the 10-volume Mission Earth, that was actually completely rewritten by Robert Vaughan Young before it was published. And it had some dreadful things in it in my interviews with Vaughan. For example, Hubbard had a character, a Native American called Tight Pussy, and Vaughan managed to get rid of that. So we also know that Hubbard didn't redraft stories when he wrote pulp stories and poured them out under many different names. there'd be a first draft. The only other writer I know of who did this was Rider Haggard, and it's a bad mistake. You should read your stuff. But I think his attention deficit meant that Hubbard had real trouble in concentrating. He had to be stimulated and excited by things all the time, so found it all but impossible to review his own work, which led us to the point in Scientology where you have a policy letter called Technical D Grades, which is on all the so-called major courses, where he says nothing he said can be cancelled. And if he contradicts himself, you can't say this was said more recently than that to determine it. And the contradictions are a river. But you can read Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky, my various papers.
Is it fair to say that you could make an argument dismissing Hubbard just from Hubbard quotes?
Oh, I have done.
There you go.
Yeah. And it's also why it's better to buy Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky than the original Piece of Blue Sky, because it's unexpurgated. I put back the 60 quotations that I'd had to paraphrase so you can see what Hubbard said, and I added quite a few more. I think there are about 40 more. These come from his private journals, from letters he wrote, and from internal harassment orders, Guardian's office material, which are fascinating. And these are primary documents. This is where, rather than somebody said something about this and I agree with them, which appears to be the method we're dealing with here, I'm sorry, Andy, you go to the primary documents. I sent Andy the 1938 letter that Hubbard sent to his wife. Its provenance is demonstrated. It's been copyrighted by Scientology, by Author Service Incorporated, indeed, by Norman Starkey. You can get it from the Library of Congress. So they've admitted to it. And in this, he explains that he doesn't believe in immortality and that his only goal is to smash his name into history. And he disregarded this letter. So you've got a, deductive, inductive, mate. Right. Jon also
doesn't believe in races.
I think the Olympics, there are lots of races going on. What's he talking about? There's the 100 metres, the 200 metres, the 400 metres, the 800 metres. Aren't there races? Why doesn't he believe in races?
And why aren't the races different for the different races?
Yes. So here's what he has to say. Jon also doesn't believe in races.
Which is ridiculous, because there's a bunch of people in Japan that look like that. There's a bunch of people in Africa that look like this. There's a bunch of people in Europe that look like that. That's the one you pull the face for. Clearly, there's races. There's different races. And he made the ridiculous leftist statement, which lefties always make,
generalities,
that there is no races. And it's like, that is just batshit crazy. Just a ridiculous statement. It's like, it's just so illogical, it's ridiculous.
Right, no races, because people look different. That seems to be the argument. Japanese people look different to African people, who look different to European people. Well, a lot of European people look different to European people too. Spanish people tend to look different to Russian people.
People are people all over the world.
People are people. So let's take this argument that people look different, therefore there are different races of people. Chihuahua, Great Dane, Pug, Bulldog, Terrier, various kinds, Aberdeen, Yorkshire, Fox, Wire-haired, Collie. Now these are creatures that look very different indeed, much more different than a Japanese person and an African person because of scale. That we're dealing with tiny little Chihuahua, great big Great Dane, and of course the Shih Tzu, which Spike Milligan rather favoured as a dog. Shih Tzu, he used to say on television. These dogs are all of the same race. They're all dogs. And they're all bred from wolves.
And of course, genetic diversity is a good thing.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you end up with a pug.
Well, you start hybridising down. If you narrow a population down into just Aryans or Nazis, then that population will fade, and you'll start getting the Habsburg chin, for example. You'll start getting the Cretin response.
The term genetic bottleneck is used for any reduction from a major population to a smaller population. It's a bad thing.
So I went and found, well actually it found me, it was a statement in New Scientist, which tends to be evidence-based, though I do have a bit of argument with them about mindfulness at the moment. This is from a geneticist, Adam Rutherford, who's at University College London, and it's from New Scientist on the 10th of July 2021, page 23. Contemporary genetics has unequivocally, let's try that in English. Contemporary genetics has unequivocally demolished the attempts to use ancestry, anatomy, and genetics to assert a biological basis for race. Although people around the world differ, the genetics underlying those differences doesn't correspond to the racial classification that we use today. Black, meaning people of recent African descent, covers more than 1 billion people with more genetic diversity than the rest of the world put together. He published a book called How to Argue with a Racist, and might be an idea to read that. So the standard test for species is if two animals can breed together and produce young that are fertile, then they're within the same species. So when a horse and a donkey breed, they produce a mule, and the mule is sterile. So they are subspecies of the equine type. Human beings can interbreed successfully.
And human beings are some of the most plastic creatures that exist, that they can change their own development more than any, learn a much wider range of things than any other creature.
And it takes us
so,
back.
Because their skin colour is different or something like that. It's just ridiculous. Because they're capable of educating themselves. You're capable of educating yourself to very high levels. So it's...
Yeah. And the point is, we'd ask Andy to go and get a genetic test to find out what race he belongs to. And it will tell him that which bits of his genome come from where. And Adam Rutherford actually puts forward the point of view that even in the classical times in Greece and in Rome, there would be Aborigine genes present, that human genome has spread and intermixed so thoroughly, not helped by Genghis Khan.
Yes.
Damn him. And we've all got a little bit of him in there. But that this intermixture continues. Now, I'm going to have to call this racism, Andy. Here is his justification, his argument. We're using genetics and comparisons of the genome. And the point I put to him in one of our conversations is that 238,000 years ago, there is a common ancestor. This was found by, I think, 147 placentas from around the world were tested for their mitochondrial DNA. That is to say, a bacterium that lives within human cells. And it has a time period, so you can actually measure when things happened. And they went back and they found a common ancestor for all 147 babies born all around the world into different, what he would call races, at 238,000 years. She's known as the mitochondrial Eve. I'm told there is work that questions this, but I've not read that. Scientifically, we should do that.
I'd just like to add also that cultural diversity is also a good thing in terms of evolution, having lots of different, if you take Avery Blanca's model culture influence back into genetics, having a large range for that sort of selection is also a good thing.
Yeah. So, the kind of blue-blooded notion or Nazism, it really isn't true. The Egyptian pharaohs used to marry their sisters, didn't do them a lot of good, frankly. But here is Andy's argument about race.
There are blacks who are great at basketball and American football. They're also not good at swimming, but whites in Europe are pretty good at swimming, but not as good as the blacks at basketball and football. White guys can't jump. There's clearly differences between races. There's also IQ testing. The average Aboriginal IQ was like 65. Okay.
We'd like to stop there, Andy, and give us evidence that the average Aboriginal IQ was like 65. We're into a place there. Firstly, IQ testing is not an adequate way of testing human beings. a book called The Mismeasure of Man. It's not me who alliterated that, by Stephen Jay Gould. Gould was a professor in 3 subjects at Harvard, and in this book he demolishes the notion of IQ testing, basically saying the Army Alpha test, which was used on conscripts and soldiers going over to Europe from the US in 1917 and 1918, devised by a man called Otis, who we will be coming back to, I'm sure, that test, when he gave it to his graduate students at Harvard, so the top 1% of the top 1% or whatever they're meant to be, the clever lot, they all failed it. An IQ test runs its average at 100, always. A moron, I think, is 80. He later accuses me of being one. And an idiot is 54 on those scales. The man who first devised IQ testing, Alfred Binet in France, said they could not be used, these tests, to measure any individual against any other. They were to be used to measure the progress of one individual. And they were particularly for people with learning difficulties. So the idea of general intelligence, I question. So let's also look at this slur against the Aborigines, who's saying are all sub-morons, or that they average out as sub-morons.
Can I read this as well? I was watching something on ABC the other day, and it was showing an Aboriginal, and he couldn't read some letter that he got from the government or something. And he's like, their IQ is that low. That's just in their gene pool. They're a different race. They can't learn. They struggle to learn how to read, And some races have high abilities, like Asians, when it comes to maths. Repeating himself.
Yeah, somewhat. So on the point of Aborigines, I disagree absolutely with what he's saying here, calling Aborigines sub-morons. I've seen Aborigines with graduate degrees talking about their custom and culture. And I would strenuously recommend Werner Herzog's film Where the Green Ants Dream, and alongside it read Bruce Chatwin's songlines and learn about the very special intelligence that Aborigines have and are able to show. So, for example, you have the learning of the songlines that he puts forward the assertion, Chatwin, that an Aborigine will have a songline running from one coast to the other of Australia, and this song is a map that describes all of the features along the way. And if you take the songline coming from the other side, which will of course be in a different dialect, even a different language, we might say, I'm not sure how far the many dialects separate, and you play it backwards to the first Aborigine, they'll recognise it.
Wow.
So we also have the idea that if you have 900 cattle and 2 of them disappear, an Aborigine herder can describe the 2 that aren't there.
Yeah.
So their perceptual level is different. He also talks about an Aborigine recognising the footprint of a friend who he's not seen for 8 years. So intelligence, these people are able to survive in a fairly barren environment. They've also somehow managed to survive the depredation and persecution of Europeans. Let's point out for the record that there was a genocide of the Tasmanian people where bounties were paid for murdering Tasmanian Aborigines. During the period in South Africa, the period of apartheid, 38 black people died in custody. And so people all over the world, myself included, refused to buy South African goods. During the same period, 180 Aborigines died in custody in Australia. So, and we're dealing here to a large extent with cultural differences, which is an aspect of symbolic evolution. There have been, Yvonne Goolagong, for example, there have been very successful Aborigines. So he then accuses me of making a moronic statement that there's no difference between the races. So I'd like to say, on IQ testing, I'm not a moron.
And he says that he's not racist.
Yeah, and he's not a racist, but he just says racist things.
He criticises Holocaust deniers, and a lot of the time they're Holocaust revisionists. They're trying to revise the history of the Holocaust. It's been majorly exaggerated as a justification to set up Israel. Jews just invaded. They literally just went in there and just said, we're creating a country. They had to say, we've been bullied for 5,000 years. They had to exaggerate the Holocaust. Look what the Germans did to us. There were heaps of Jews in prison camps and gypsies. They were being used for the war effort, like in America. The Japanese had to be locked up. I don't know who was, some Jewish council announced an attack on Germany.
So we're running ahead. I think you've got the old version of this. You should have in your email a newer version. Which
this is the last one you sent to me.
It says final on it. Yeah.
This is the same one.
Okay, run down, because under Holocaust there should be a note, which I'm not seeing. It'll be in square brackets. Keep going down. Okay,
This is it. Yeah, it's the same document. That will be in this one.
Yeah, we'll go back to that. That's not the note I was talking about.
Okay.
So I'm going to have to pick this up. The Holocaust is the systematic genocide or extermination of the Jews, the Romanies and other peoples. To say that you are revising the Holocaust when you don't believe there was a systematic extermination is not Holocaust revisionism, it's Holocaust denial. Sorry, so much here.
I mean, you should watch Dad's and Ed's videos on the
Holocaust denial. Eddie cited 25 reference books simply on the Holocaust itself, not his whole reading on Hitler and the Nazis. And the idea that Israel, that the Jews went there and took over, just said we're creating a country. No, it was basically the Arab uprising of 1936 against the awful British rule there. A man called Orde Wingate, who would later go on to head the Chindits in Burma, was put in by the British military under Alexander Wavell to train Haganah, the Jewish force, in terrorist activities against the Arabs. And that's what happened. And there were horrors on either side. Haganah then turned its attention, and along with Irgun and the Stern Gang, to the British. So the techniques they'd been trained in, in pretty much the same way that the Americans trained the Mujahideen in Afghanistan and then got Al-Qaeda out of it. So the agreement had been made in 1917 in the Balfour Declaration that there would be a homeland for the Jews in Palestine, and it was accepted by the United Nations. So the Jews didn't invade the country and say we're creating a country. I am not a supporter of the way that Israel was created, but that's another conversation. Israel is a fact of life now, so we have to live with it, but we also have to bring justice for all of the people involved there, which is not really happening. So the Jews, here we get into the anti-Semitism, I'm afraid, had to say...
They had to say we've been bullied for 5,000 years, and they had to exaggerate the Holocaust, so they acted like poor victims. Look what the Germans did to us.
Yep,
There were heaps of Jews in prison camps and gypsies. They were being used for the war effort. Not to take that point, that they were being used for the war effort. Like in America, the Japanese had to be locked up.
Yeah, so the idea is that what he is saying in his, what he says is a revision of the Holocaust, is actually a revision of the account of how Jews came to die. that, as in America, where the Japanese were locked up, though the Italians and the Germans weren't, which is an interesting piece of racism. There's a great book called Snow Falling on Cedars, a novel about, very well researched, about the camps used in America. Those camps were not labour camps. The Japanese were not forced to work. They were not enslaved.
And the elderly and the children weren't.
Well, he gets to it, and we will too.
I don't know who was. Some Jewish council announced an attack on Germany.
So some Jewish council announced an attack on Germany. So that meant the Jews were enemies. So there's the presumption that there's this nation of Jewry, these people who are the Zionist conspiracy. This is an absolute nonsense. If you put two rabbis in the room, you get three opinions. There are conservative Jews, there are ultra-Orthodox and Orthodox Jews, there are many sects of Judaism. Jews do not share the same bloodline. There are black Jews, there are Eastern European Jews who are descended from the Khazars. The Invention of the Jewish People by Shlomo Sand, who's a professor at Tel Aviv University, is a very interesting reference book. To say that there is no central Jewish committee running this. So if some Jews announced an attack on Germany, that's rather like saying that when Al-Qaeda, the terrorist group, announced an attack on the US, because they're a Saudi Arabian group, the US should have attacked Saudi Arabia.
Yes, it's ridiculous.
And it does, not very keen on Saudi Arabia either.
So the idea that it was some kind of response when Hitler talks about in Mein Kampf the ideas of does he talk about exterminating Jews in Mein Kampf?
No.
But talks about
the Jewish problem is discussed, and the idea of exporting Jews is taken up. It's only at the Vinci conference in 1942 that the final solution is determined. By that time, though, many Jews have been killed.
Yes.
There is no direct order from Hitler.
Loads of documents were destroyed.
He later on says that I won't believe something until I've got a document in my hand. Well, Holocaust deniers won't believe it because they don't have an order from Hitler. But they do have orders from Himmler, who was the Minister of the Interior, the head of the Gestapo, the head of the SS, the head of the Ahnenerbe Ministry, and the head of the Lebensborn Ministry. And there is no doubt that there was a deliberate policy of extermination. The book Denying History by Michael Sherman and a guy called Grobman is a superb analysis, and also shows that there is such a thing as scientific history. This notion that history is written by the victors, that's gone.
Yeah.
There's the internet. All sorts of people since 1945 have been writing their own accounts. So some Holocaust denier like David Irving, for example, nobody stopped him from publishing books.
And again, on the details, you go much more into it with the videos with Ed. Holocaust.
Yeah, and so please. So
they got used for the war effort. Right? And it wasn't like just shiploads of them were rocking up, just getting sent into ovens and getting cooked. It's a real exaggeration. There's even a Jewish guy who looked into the truth of the camps and found that a lot of it is just lies and exaggeration.
So let's just pause on the idea that Jews were killed by being put into ovens and cooked. I think he's mistaking what the crematoria were used for and what the gas chambers and the gas vans were used for. There were also mass shootings in Belarus. You had whole villages were rounded up, put into barns. The barns were set on fire and people machine gunned. There is film of this. There are testimonies from literally hundreds of thousands of people, not simply victims who survived, but also everybody from camp commandants down. When Hus, who was the first camp commandant of Auschwitz, was interviewed at Nuremberg, it was put to him that he had supervised the execution of 1.25 million Jews, and his response is, yes, he executed and exterminated those people. So you also have camp guards who came forward after the war and knew that they could face a death sentence for admitting what they were admitting. So carbon monoxide vans and the Zyklon B gas chambers are a reality that is beyond question. Let's take up this particular thing about there's even a Jewish guy. Now, the Jewish guy is David Cole, also known as David Stein. He wrote for the Guardian newspaper, and that newspaper put forward that his belief was not that it was, a lot of it is just lies and exaggerations. What he said was Auschwitz was not an extermination camp in the manner of Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec and Chelmno, which he, Cole, acknowledged were part of a genocidal program against Polish Jews. That the Holocaust ended in 1943, he believed, when the Nazis realised they needed Jewish slave labour for factories, and that there was no overarching genocidal plan, but an evolving, morphing policy which claimed perhaps 4 million rather than 6 million Jewish lives. So his Jew who denies the Holocaust doesn't deny the Holocaust. He just mistakenly, for reasons beyond me, doesn't accept that Auschwitz was an extermination camp.
And just to get a quote, 6 million to 4 million is not a real exaggeration.
Yeah.
My grandpa, who was in Europe at the time, he said to me it was an exaggeration.
So, like, his grandfather was in Madrid, Paris, and said, I can tell you that nothing was happening at Auschwitz. Unless you were in the places mentioned, how could you say that? Now, here I do have a personal story. My father was at Belsen.
Yeah.
My father was in the British Liberating Force at Belsen. The movie, a documentary, A Painful Reminder about that, shows in graphic detail the horrors, and where the claim is made that the Jews starved because the Allies had restricted the food supply to Germany. It was decided to make the local townspeople bury the corpses of the Jews, and you can see on the film that the local townspeople are nowhere near as emaciated as the Jews. The Jews were systematically starved.
Yeah.
I think we've already taken up the point that he's not a revisionist of Holocaust, he is a Holocaust denier.
Yeah, and again, a revisionist would be somebody who would use evidence.
Yeah, rather than what they thought was true. Oh, here's the note I was looking for. The Holocaust is the genocide of European Jews and other groups by the Nazis during World War II. That is from the Free Dictionary. And a Holocaust is a great slaughter or massacre from the Oxford English Dictionary. So he's not revising the Holocaust, he's saying there wasn't a Holocaust.
What they did is they killed people who were unable to work, probably old people and sick.
And children and pregnant mothers. Also the T4 programme before World War II, which killed perhaps 200,000 disabled people. So these genocidal programmes, this Holocaust was taking place.
Hitler also said numerous times, hey, if you guys stop the war, then I'll stop using Jews as workers in the camps.
We'd like a source, just one source on that, because far from numerous times we're not aware of any time that Hitler said that, because we're not aware that there was a public statement about Jews being used as workers in the camps during World War II. But so, Andy, provide us with some of the numerous times.
Not only that, England and America bombed the camps, and they bombed the supply lines to the camps and starved out the workers.
Okay. I'm not aware of any bombing of a labour camp or a concentration camp, if you could provide us with evidence. I've been told that, or have read that Churchill was criticised for not bombing the supply lines, the railway lines in. So if he has evidence of that, I could be wrong about that. But what we do is evidence-based. So we go from there, starved out the workers.
A lot of that footage you see of all the skinny Jews at the end of the war, that's propaganda. They had to justify a massive war because Americans didn't even want to get involved in World War II. They had to get brainwashed by the media into supporting war.
Yeah, well, there's a a quirk of history here. The Americans didn't need to be persuaded of anything. Germany declared war on America on the 11th of December 1941. So America wasn't dragged into the war in the way that Andy Nolch believes. So there was no need for propaganda. And those skinny Jews, what an insulting phrase.
Skeletal.
Yes, emaciated. There are so many photographs taken by the Nazis themselves, some of them, and used in propaganda, that show that a huge amount of people were maltreated in this way. So this is just insulting to survivors of that terrible conflagration. Yeah, at the end of the war, they had to show all this footage saying, see how bad the Germans were. Well, it's real footage, folks.
Yeah. My great-grandpa died in one of the camps. He died because of the Americans bombing the camp.
So we'd like to know which camp that was, and whether we're talking about a prisoner of war camp or a concentration camp.
Yeah.
Because is he telling us he's Jewish?
You're not going to hear about all the dodgy stuff that England and America did in the war. All we're hearing about is all the anti-German stuff.
I've read a significant amount of stuff criticising the behaviour of the Americans and the British during World War II. So that's just not true. You have to go and look for it. You can't expect it to be fed to you on a plate. But for example, look at Coca-Cola, who, when under American law you couldn't invest anymore in Nazi Germany, they created the Fanta Corporation. Look at the financiers in America who poured money into Germany for the war. This is, you don't need conspiracy theories here. These things were happening. And it's also true to say that there were barbarous events. It's well known that the Russians, as they moved through to Berlin, caused absolute mayhem. It's been said by some authors that no female between the ages of 8 and 80 would not be raped. That's hopefully an exaggeration, but the Russians, or the Soviets, having suffered casualties of between 20 and 28 million, were bent on revenge, and that does not justify what they did. So horrors were committed. There was also a British camp where, after the war, Nazis were tortured in the attempt to denazify them. So, no, the dodgy stuff is there. It's just not reported in Nexus magazine.
Yes, you're just not reading.
You have to get out of the echo chamber.
Yeah. Because the side that wins is the side that writes the history books.
No sides involved. You can write a history book, Andy, and you can publish it yourself. So that's just not right.
And John bagged the Nexus magazine, and Nexus magazine is a good magazine.
It has alternative facts, has alternative information.
You can predict a future with it.
With Nexus magazine.
Talking about COVID vaccines and side effects and government control.
Yeah. All right. Nexus magazine. A friend of mine was the first distributor, or a former friend of mine, I haven't seen him for a long time, was a former original distributor of Nexus magazine in the UK. So I got to see Nexus magazine when it came out. I remember having a long conversation with him, about 3 hours, about the Holocaust, which started with him saying there was no Holocaust. By the end of the conversation, he said, well, yes, okay, there was a Holocaust. I disagree on the numbers. And so I said, how many? He said 2 million. He'd accept the 2 million. And I said, that's pretty bad, isn't it?
Yeah.
And he said, yes. And a week later, he was at a party at my house, 2 in the morning or something, and I came to my kitchen and he was explaining to a young woman, there was no Holocaust, so I threw him out.
Executed and exterminated.
Executed and exterminated. Nexus magazine is a ragbag of conspiracy theories and ideas which are not checked. There's no peer review. So I gave up on it when I saw a reprint of a Scientology Freedom magazine story in there, which had not been checked in any way. So it's not a reliable source of information. They like Donald Trump. I mean, how can you trust them?
Jon, that brings us back to Jon criticises the whole Trump and the Q movement. He doesn't even know that it's all a freaking scam, but he criticises it with no awareness that it's a government conspiracy.
Okay, well, I have done a certain amount of work on QAnon, the Q drops, the claim that there is a top, the guy with Q clearance, top clearance in the government who's leaking these things. Their origin may well be disaffected members of the American intelligence establishment. General Michael Flynn has been named. So it may also have a certain element of Russian discord going on in it. It is a freaking scam, I agree with you, Andy. But I don't believe, if it's a government scam, do you mean it's Trump doing it? Because he was the guy running the government and he could have closed it down. I'd also like to point out, and this doesn't seem to have been said anywhere that I'm aware of, that linguistic analysis should have got the FBI to the author of the Q drops within a matter of a few weeks. He's now made 4,000 posts. It's very easy to go through Twitter feeds and find such a person because his punctuation is bizarre, his spelling is bizarre, and his overall state. So I think they probably know who it is, and they probably...
when they use the time codes, I don't remember the specific times, but for example, like 9 a.m. to 11 a.m. in the morning.
Well, yeah, in the first post, the Hillary Clinton will be arrested between 7:45 a.m. and 8:30 a.m. in the morning. And he capitalises, he does all sorts of things, he or she.
Yeah.
So who cares? What has this got to do with Ron Hubbard and Scientology and whether I'm accurate on that? Keep going till you see red.
That's where the real power lies in the intelligence agencies. Trump didn't have control of them.
Well, Trump did manage to replace James Comey as the head of the FBI, so I would say that indicates control. And as the president, he had it in his gift to change the heads of any of those organisations. So that's just wrong. It's just trying to confirm your own thinking. But let me say that he says the intelligence agencies are a bunch of lefties, which is an overall insult term for Andy. I don't think they're a bunch of lefties. I think they're a bunch of authoritarians. I think they're a bunch of righties. There are 17 intelligence agencies in the United States. They employ about 200,000 people, and I think they are dreadful. I think that they have performed so many antisocial and despicable acts that we need to be very careful about them. So there you go. Let's move on. Trump didn't do anything about that. And he's saying that he had no access to the intelligence agencies. The man who dismissed the head of the FBI, I don't think so. Trump's getting rid of the pedophiles, we find. Don't have any real evidence for that.
He mentioned Scott Morrison in the same sentence as Putin and Trump.
Yeah, so Scott Morrison, Putin and Trump were all national leaders. You're not allowed to mention them in the same sentence. I don't understand the logic of that. He tells us that Morrison's nothing like Putin or Trump. I was just saying, in fact, that I mentioned Duterte and Bolsonaro and Abe and Modi and Xi in the same sentence too, which was to say, look at how deplorable the leaders we have at the moment are.
Yes.
So I think I'm allowed to put that in the sentence.
And he criticises it because, Bolsonaro is a lefty, or no,
Morrison is a lefty.
Yeah, according to him.
Which is a left-handed person, I think. That means
yes.
Southpaw.
He reckons that Hubbard wasn't an intelligence agent.
Yeah. Now, I don't reckon it, mate.
Yeah.
I read his 800-page war record, and then I reread it with somebody who was in the Navy at the same time alongside his record. We're going to get to Fletcher Prouty, but I took all of Prouty's actual statements and I analysed this material and compared it. And Aaron Hubbard was appointed as an intelligence officer, but he was never with US Navy intelligence. He was appointed as an officer within the Office of Cable Censorship, where an intelligence officer would be somebody who basically went through letters home and censored them. He would teach people how to recognise enemy ships and planes and their own ships and planes. That was his job. That was called an intelligence officer, and it's led to incredible confusion. But lest we get confused about what Ron Hubbard was doing during World War II, let's use now Ron Hubbard's statement. This comes from the LRH Conference with the Investigators, Part 1, May the 6th, 1966. It's a lecture which exists in the Information Full Hat Pack. It's in the second pack, and it's document number 109. A friend of mine reconstructed the Branch 1 intelligence agent training manual, the Information Full Hat. And so this is Ron Hubbard speaking about his career in Navy intelligence. I myself am not unfamiliar with your line of country, intelligence. I was a D3 officer of naval intelligence with the US Navy in the Asiatic Fleet at the beginning of World War II. Served previously around Washington and New York. In the spring of 1942, bear in mind that Pearl Harbor is on the 7th of December 1941. In the spring of 1942, they, however, found they had great scarcity of master mariners, and so on. And the FBI took over the complete entirety of naval intelligence at that time, which I don't believe is true, and so those of us who were qualified as deck officers were transferred over the line, and I went from there. So what he's telling us is that from December to the spring of 41 to the spring of 42, he was posted as an intelligence officer, which his record confirms. He was censoring cables, he was in Australia, he was not doing spy work, he was never involved in that, and he himself is saying that from spring 42 he wasn't doing this.
Does actually seem like Hubbard was doing operations on his Apollo ship, and Hubbard was a shifty government intelligence agent.
Yeah, well, I'd have to see some evidence of that, because while the locals in Madeira believed that the ship was the CIA because they couldn't understand what a management training corporation was doing with people in sailor suits, and I must say I find that difficult too. And they were at the point where their fascist dictator of Portugal was being overthrown, and so they were very frightened because there was a lot of news about the CIA maybe intervening. But beyond that, I'm not aware of anything that would connect Hubbard to government intelligence agencies, and yes, I have looked into Virginia McClory's material on this, and no, I am not in the least bit convinced.
Saying that Trump's a bully is just ridiculous.
He's obsessed with Donald Trump.
Yeah.
Got nothing to do with this, Andy.
There are only predators and prey.
There are only predators and prey. Saying that Trump's a bully is just ridiculous. Grabbing women by their pussies, that's not bullying. Let's just move on.
Yeah.
You must be in love with him.
Send him some flowers or something.
This is of Trump. He was too polite. He was too reasonable.
Yes.
Well, yeah. Let's move on. He was ineffectual. He did not drain the swamp. He had 4 years to do it.
I don't like people criticising Putin. I think Putin's a good guy.
All right. Have a look at the Chechen War and what happened there. Read Peter Pomerantsev, Nothing is True and Everything is Possible, and his other book, This Is Not Propaganda, and read Craig Unger's book about Russia. Trump's a good guy. Well, okay.
Putin's a good guy.
You need some evidence, man.
If you're a person who's saying Trump and Putin are bad, you're saying I'm basically a brainwashed idiot. Let's just move on from that. Jon Atack, he's brainwashed by the anti-Putin stuff.
Well, as I say, I've referred to 3 books that I'm aware of on the subject, 2 of which I've read cover to cover.
Just ridiculous seeing the way Xi Jinping and Putin react to ridiculous stuff that Americans and Australian politicians do. They're much more sensible and reasonable in their responses.
So Xi Jinping is more sensible in his responses. This is a man who put 1 million people into labour camps in Xinjiang on the grounds that they were terrorists because they're Muslims. Reasonable, sensible.
And, his deputy, said on the BBC a little while ago that human rights shouldn't be a general thing, it should be specific to the countries.
Yeah.
So I think he should send his family over here so I can whip them a little bit and send them back.
And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is to be avoided, you know. But we're going on and on here. So far we're 40 minutes into his diatribe, and we've had this. I reckon that Hubbard wasn't an intelligence agent, and I used the word brainwashed instead of conditioned about a letter. I'm not really feeling the foundations of my work cracking here.
Jon mentions how LRH was asked about reincarnation in an interview he did on the ship.
The Shrinking World of L. Ron Hubbard.
LRH pauses and then says, "Oh yeah, my followers do
believe in
reincarnation." Jon's implying that LRH doesn't believe in reincarnation.
In the 1938 letter, which I sent before this was produced, which I sent to Andy, he says personal immortality is only to be gained through the printed word, barred note or painted canvas or hard graphite. I think he meant granite, but in the original it says graphite. So he denied immortality at that point. So his pause I find very interesting.
It's a hat that he's calling an orange.
So I'm faulty, I call hats oranges. Here we go, 3 times in the whole text I call hats oranges.
He's also had a go at Fletcher Prouty. Prouty said that if you look at Hubbard's war history, that Hubbard was an intelligence officer. Jon Atack attacked Fletcher Prouty for saying that.
Well, I've been through that, and I went through it in the interview he did with me. I read the war records, also read the Veterans Administration records, Hubbard's FBI records, which are quite interesting, Hubbard's father's Navy records. This is a lot of material. It's not a paragraph in Nexus. I went and looked into the primary documents. I read everything that Prouty had said. He was paid $1,000 a day by his own admission. I anticipated that I would end up in court against him, but he stopped working for Scientology and I stopped reporting on Scientology, so it didn't happen. But there are 2 points. Russell Miller, in the talk he did for us that we showed at the Getting Clear conference in Toronto, which is on my channel. I think my first talk at Toronto then segs into Russell's talk. Russell's a world-famous biographer, Getty, Hefner, Conan Doyle and Barefaced Messiah. I worked on Barefaced Messiah from the start. He had a copy of what would later become Let's Sell These People, Piece of Blue Sky.
The chapter titles come from you.
He took 4 chapter titles from me, and I've got his manuscript. It came back to me through Chris Owen, and I can see where he's crossed out bits and which bits he's going to use. But about 50% of the book is his own research. And he looked at it and he said, look, what Prouty is saying is that the whole record, and we've seen that Hubbard makes no claim beyond the spring of 1942 to be involved in intelligence. His record is sheep-dipped. So there's a fake record, so if any enemy agents get into the records department of the US Navy, they will be deceived into believing that he was a serving master mariner, deck officer, as he says of himself. Well, Prouty makes a claim on which he bases everything, which is that there's a code on Hubbard's orders, that the number 16 appears the left-hand side of all of Hubbard's orders. It does. However, about every 100 pages through the pack, you have a printed sheet of what the codes mean. 16 means a reserve officer. That is somebody who had joined the Navy but was put on reserve until such time as they were needed. The way that I was able to check that this number 16 absolutely meant what they say it does is that the guy I went through the record with, and his record, who served during World War II in the Navy, was also a member of the US Navy Reserve, and also on all of his orders had the number 16, which he was never in intelligence. Yeah. So Prouty's argument was false. But as Russell Miller said, why would you give him such a terrible record about him being an awful officer and not being allowed command if he'd actually, you put something anodyne and nice.
That's something that wouldn't stand out.
And Fletcher Prouty also tells us, apparently,
fossil fuels are actually renewable.
Keep going.
Fossil fuels like grow. There's only a certain amount of oil in the earth. It's just oil propaganda.
Oil propaganda. So, excuse me, ladies and gentlemen, I'm just topping up here.
Go
Are
on.
you okay? Oh
Yeah,
no, you've got a whole glass full.
I have,
You don't
yeah.
need any more. You might like a sip. Fossil fuels are actually renewable. They grow. Well, grow might not be the right word for things rotting, but they're not limited. This whole idea that there's only a certain amount of oil on the earth is just oil propaganda. There's only a certain amount of anything on the earth. Nothing is infinite, and that includes oil.
Like to see
How you renew.
make some oil for
Yeah.
us if it's so easy to do, if it's so renewable and it doesn't have to be pressurized for millions of years.
Hundreds of thousands, I'd have thought.
Check.
So, yeah, I mean, you can use cooking oil, but that's not what we're talking about. So,
Or olive oil.
and the problem is not whether the oil's going to run out. By fracking and various means, there's quite a lot of oil. The problem is how much damage it's causing getting it out, where fracking is there is some concern, and whether it is creating the greenhouse effect. And there does seem to be rather a lot of evidence to suggest that that's what fossil fuels are doing. So, and as we develop better technologies, not just wind and solar, but ultimately we'll probably get to photosynthesis and understand how that works. And then we won't need dirty fuels like oil and coal. Oil propaganda. There's nobody like the oil companies for putting out propaganda.
Yes. Very smart guys, not like Jon Atack. Well, I mean, that's true. I'm sorry to be offensive to Jon
I
Atack.
don't think you are.
Which I'm just want to say that's how we managed to dismiss so many points so far, because you're not intelligent.
I'm not smart.
Just not smart.
Yeah. I've got a 65 IQ,
Yeah.
if that.
Yeah. I might even send him it.
This
this
video.
video.
He didn't, by the way.
Yeah.
Just a
Should
speculation.
we send this to him?
Now, he's talked about being passive aggressive. So where do you go with this? He doesn't respond to me. He doesn't come and ask me, and I've been perfectly friendly to him. As he says, I smile a lot. All he had to do was ask, and instead he makes this secret briefing, closed door secret briefing. So I might even send him it.
Yeah. I like the truth. I like good quality information. Yep, let's see how he responds to this video.
Yeah, let's see the truth and the good quality.
The American government killed their own president.
JFK.
Yeah, it's just like 9/11. They blew up their own World Trade Center buildings.
Yeah. Okay.
Nice.
Moving on swiftly.
Because he's watched the JFK movie, that's how he knows this.
And Nexus.
The media is always scripted.
I've worked with over 200 journalists in the last 37 years. Radio, TV, print media, and these days internet. And I have seen the stories written, and the media isn't always scripted. That the extent to which governments have an effect on it, or the Murdochs and the Maxwells of this world, two Australians, there is a tremendous effect. But you have the media of different nations. I mean, yes, certainly Russian TV is scripted. RT, that's an astonishing piece of propaganda. And again, please read Peter Pomerantsev on that subject. Yeah. He worked in Russian media for about 5 years, and so he saw what was going on. He says this thing here I thought was quite strange.
How did New Zealand News publish a news report saying Lee Harvey Oswald, whereas at that very moment they hadn't even arrested?
Yeah, that's my fault. The did it needs to be in, I think.
Sorry. How did New Zealand News publish a news report saying Lee Harvey Oswald did it, whereas at that very moment they hadn't even arrested Lee Harvey Oswald?
Well, we'd like to see the New Zealand report, please, Andy. And we'll tell you what we think about it when we've seen the actual report. Rather than somebody talking about the report, we'd like to see something that shows us that it was published at that time.
Yes. How many references in Blue Sky?
1,117. You can check any of them.
Cool. Trump's actually pretty lucky because he really could have been assassinated.
Yeah, well, I don't know what to say
Any
about
president.
that. I don't think the swamp was that deep. I think it would have been.
Yeah.
There he goes on his hobby horse about Karen de la Carrière and Jeffrey Augustine, and they're somehow connected to the CIA, and because he thinks so.
Hubbard's life just reeks of an intelligent agent, really. We can't say for sure.
Yeah, we can't say for sure. So, reeks.
How does someone know about all this sort of stuff? Because he was a trained intelligence officer.
Well, no. He was trained in censoring letters home. He was trained in showing people what ships and planes look like. The reason that he knows about this, you can find, again, a bit of research. The Information Full Hat. Anybody researching Scientology has to read The Information Full Hat, beginning to end. Sorry. That is the training for an intelligence officer as approved by Ron Hubbard. And in the Full Hat you will find 2 books which show how he knew what he said about intelligence. One of them is Sefton Delmar, Black Boomerang. The other is Christopher Felix, The Spy and His Masters. They're antiquated now. But you can read about these techniques, Andy. You don't have to have been there to make these claims. John denies that he was a trained intelligence officer. No, he was a trained intelligence officer. He never worked in naval intelligence, and an intelligence officer, cable censor.
Of course, Karen manipulates John.
Yeah, right.
He's a victim of conspiracies, and because he doesn't believe in conspiracies. Do you believe in conspiracies?
Yeah, of course I do.
Do you believe the government is feeding you incorrect information about Scientology?
I've not had the government feed me any information about Scientology. The only thing that's relevant to that would be the Foster report of 1971, a government inquiry headed by Sir John Foster, who was a member of Parliament and a barrister, what's called a Queen's Counsel, a silk. And it is a superb piece of investigation, largely based upon reproducing statements by Ron Hubbard. So, but no government agencies are feeding me stuff. Most of my material comes from Hubbard's own books and statements, where he contradicts himself and falls all over the place. And then he talks about COVID-19.
I do believe that there is a bug that's going around, but it's very, very mild.
Yep. And
government is exaggerated, like there's no tomorrow, shutting all these things down and forcibly vaccinating people.
I haven't heard of anybody being forcibly vaccinated. And an exaggeration, well, we have 130,000 deaths in this country. And you can't make stuff like that up, country by country, because there are too many people who are observing family members dying. I heard of a case where a nurse who was working, and they're working so hard at the moment, have been, and she was just sick and tired of seeing protesters outside the hospital saying this isn't real, and she was saying, come in, work, see the people dying as I am. So forcibly vaccinating people, we'd like evidence of that, Andy, and it must be on a massive scale for it to be of concern. It's like
World War One, where the government intentionally got a ship sunk, so then they could go into World War One.
Okay, 3 US ships were sunk without warning by U-boats on the 18th of March 1917. War was then declared on April the 6th. But the US didn't enter the war because of the sinking of 3 ships, not a ship. That was the final provocation. It entered the war because of what's called the Zimmermann Telegraph, which basically was a telegram, Zimmermann Telegram, was passed by British intelligence and had been found. It's a German offer to the Mexicans saying the Mexicans should invade the United States and they would help them out. Good book about this, Barbara Tuchman the Zimmermann Telegraph. She does call it telegraph. There you go. I thought it was a telegram.
Like America going into World War One, then World War Two. America let Pearl Harbor happen right intentionally.
That's an amazing statement. The Japanese magic code had been cracked by code breakers. So when an order went out telling the Japanese embassies and consulates in the United States to destroy their code machine, their magic machines, it was known that there was going to be an attack. That happened the night before Pearl Harbor. And Admiral Kimmel, who was running the Pacific Fleet in Pearl Harbor, was not told. He was later blamed, but the idea that you're going to sacrifice a whole fleet, including a couple of aircraft carriers, just so you can get into a war is preposterous. That, losing maybe one, but putting your whole defence at risk. If Pearl Harbor had been fully successful, if the aircraft carriers had been in port, there is some chance that the Japanese might have won. Luckily, they didn't. Okay. We went over, there's a lot of stuff here I'm just not going to bother with. So here we have the third criticism of me. We're now at an hour in, and this is the third criticism of my research into Scientology and Ron Hubbard.
Jon attacks Hubbard, calling an incident the Piltdown Man in the History of Man book, and the Piltdown Man was a hoax.
And so I shouldn't call it that, because I shouldn't criticise him for using the name of a hoax, Piltdown Man, where an ape jaw had been added to a human cranium, completely forged, because it's an ape man. And the strange thing is that in all the years, the book came out in 1952, there's been no correction of that error. And at the start, of course, the book claims to be a cold-blooded and factual account of your last 60 trillion years. Now, David Miscavige has changed that to 76 trillion years, contrary to the technical degrades policy, which says you can't change anything, Hubbard said. But it's meant to be a factual account.
And of course we evolved from clams, according.
Boohoos and the Grim Weeper, through the sloth on our evolutionary line, which nobody else has found there. So, yeah, okay. I'm still not impressed by this refutation.
The incident could be real. I don't even believe in the incident.
So he doesn't believe in it, but he doesn't want me to criticise it.
I agree with Jon about a lot of things.
Yeah, let's hear some of them.
Jon Atack talks about the ship interview. Hubbard did. He says that Hubbard was terrible.
This is again the shrinking world of L. Ron Hubbard, a must-watch for anybody who's been around Scientology or not. It's only 20 minutes long. It's on YouTube.
I had no second wife.
Yep, that's right.
Just a first and a third.
First and a third wife.
I don't think that was a terrible interview.
So watch it for yourself and see whether you think the man blinking at the camera and shuddering is the greatest expert on public relations in the world.
It's on YouTube, right?
It is on YouTube.
Yep. He sees a hat and thinks it's orange. The hat's orange now?
Yeah, it's not, not orange anymore.
What are the oranges of this?
The only kind of mistake was the ex-wife thing.
Yeah. I think as a half a Scientologist...
What's the other half?
Space Cowboy.
So, well, no, he's an all space cowboy, half Scientologist.
Right.
Is he like Catholic, Buddhist? Is he like Jesus the Buddha?
He'll be like, you've got to see that interview.
So I'm saying watch the interview, and he's criticising me for my estimation of it.
Yeah. He said remote viewing doesn't exist. Which the CIA doesn't go around telling everyone that remote viewing works, is because it's a weapon that they want to keep secret.
Well, some secret. I mean, we've known about remote viewing because of what Uri Geller, Ingo Swann, Pat Price did at Stanford in 72. Since Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ, the physicists who ran the experiments, published a book about it. That's how secret it is. That was in the 70s. The Spoonbenders Project, as some of us call it, the men who stare at goats, ran in the CIA from 1972 to 1995. It's no big secret. You can get documents on it.
And the government have UFOs. It's an incredibly advanced craft that they keep secret, apparently.
They do.
You can psychically, magically somehow access information in your mind, and some people naturally have this psychic ability.
I haven't met one of them yet, Andy. Send me some evidence that supports this. Now, during our conversations, I recommended a documentary called Exposed: Magicians, Psychics and Frauds, about James Randi, and he gets into remote viewing and how to do it, among many other things. He debunked Uri Geller on many occasions, and many other people. The response I got from Andy was he didn't like James Randi. When I asked why, he didn't explain, but he wasn't willing to watch anything.
Is it because he put up $1 million for anybody that could prove that they had psychic powers?
Probably.
Yes. Remote viewing is real and psychic abilities are real. Just have to fact check.
Okay, so let's see the facts, Andy.
He's studied remote viewing.
Yeah. I mean, for example, Uri Geller in the Stanford thing, one of the things he did was he'd say that what the person, he'd make a drawing which was meant to be what was, in the box.
Yeah.
And it interested me that he did indeed at one point make a drawing of, a child's ship, the sail ship. But his drawing did not match. It was a drawing of a ship, but it didn't match. And that interests me because if you were remotely viewing rather than guessing, you would give something that was pretty exact. Derren Brown has, in his Messiah, debunked remote viewing and did it to the satisfaction of various psychic investigators, and then showed how he'd done it, how he'd primed the person to think something before they put it down. And remote viewing is a 100% real thing. Okay, let's see it. And he then goes on, a university mathematician called
Courtney Brown. He's a mathematician. He scientifically proves remote viewing on a daily
basis. Spends every day doing it. Brown is also a long-term adherent of transcendental meditation and claims to be able to fly.
Nice.
Haven't seen any evidence of that. Wikipedia says Brown's remote viewing findings have been dismissed by scientists such as his colleague at Emory University, Scott O'Lilienfeld, who has stated that Brown has refused to subject his ideas and his claimed psychic powers to independent scientific testing on what Lilienfeld describes as curious grounds. So what he's got is a guy who's saying, I've done this.
Yeah, which is 100% real, according to him.
Yeah, 100%.
I asked him about the Illuminati.
Oh, here we go.
The Illuminati is absolutely real. Okay. It's been around since like the 1500s.
Well, no. Wikipedia, founded on the 1st of May 1776 in Bavaria, there is no evidence that the Bavarian Illuminati survived its suppression in 1785. It was a group that sought to import Enlightenment ideas, particularly from France, into Bavaria, and to use reasoning rather than emotion as a basis. And it failed, I'm afraid. What makes this more difficult, and you can do the research for yourself, but if you research the Discordians, these two guys, Thornley and Hill, they put forward this idea. They wanted to make a conspiracy theory that was the most ridiculous thing possible. And they started writing letters to Playboy magazine in the, I think, the late 60s, and about the Illuminati, this conspiracy that ruled the world. And there happened to be two editors working for Playboy who loved these letters, Robert Shea and Anton Wilson. And they produced a series of novels called Illuminatus, which I did read many years ago. And it's a myth. It's a creation, and it gets worse.
People like Leonardo da Vinci were involved, and it was really big in Italy. Yeah.
No, it didn't exist. Da Vinci died in 1517, I think, 1452 to 50. That's what's in my head. So it'd have to be right at the beginning of the 1500s. There is no evidence that Da Vinci was involved in any secret society. At the time, it would be more likely claimed he was a member of the Hermes Trismegistus Society, but he wasn't.
It's like totally secret.
It's not that totally secret.
Like, dude, read a Dan Brown book on the Illuminati. Dan Brown lays down the truth about the Illuminati.
Facepalm. Dan Brown wrote a novel. I don't want to get into the, somewhere else we might do this. In 1978, an English TV guy called Henry Lincoln put up a show saying that Jesus and Mary Magdalene had fled to Europe, that their children, their descendants, had become the Merovingian kings of France, and that what was being claimed was that this Frenchman was in fact the heir to the throne and a descendant, and that this was the Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, which became the title of a very big selling book around about 1981 or 2. And the documentary evidence is fake. It's in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. The guy who faked it was interviewed. He was a young French aristocrat, and as with most French aristocrats, had no money because it was taken from them in the revolution. And he faked these documents at the request of the guy who said he was the descendant of the Merovingian kings. That guy had just come out of prison where he'd been for collaborating with the Nazis during World War II. It's just a bunch of made-up stories about the Knights Templar. And yes, I didn't just read Dan Brown. I read The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail. I saw the Henry Lincoln documentary. But around the time of The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, I met a man who was a BBC researcher who was an expert on the Knights Templar and the Freemasons. And he said every time he went to a meeting held by the Holy Blood, Holy Grail people, they'd throw him out. Because he'd say, you're talking nonsense and this is why.
Yeah.
So, lays down the truth. So we're looking to novels to find the truth now, not...
Yes. Hubbard was a genius. His religion was dodgy. Hubbard was shifty himself and borderline insane. But he still isn't full of complete crap. It's still worth doing Scientology.
Well, it actually says he's still worth doing Scientology.
But
You're right.
Yeah.
It's still worth trying and exposing yourself to it, because you find out about unusual things. Now, here's a problem that I have. He's borderline insane. He's dodgy.
Yes.
But it's still worth doing Scientology. I'm having a problem with that.
And he brainwashed you.
And apparently he brainwashed us all.
Yes.
We were brainwashed by Scientology. So it's okay to be brainwashed by a borderline insane, dodgy person.
Because you learn something from it.
Yeah.
What is it that you learn? Is it that you shouldn't be brainwashed by a borderline insane person?
Well, this is what you learn.
You learn how to freaking well read.
I already knew how to read. Jon Atack says
that you don't get any wins from Scientology.
I've never said that. I've said that it's up to the individual to determine what benefits they gained from whatever they did. And I've been consistent in saying that for decades. I had benefit from Scientology. But I also had deficit from Scientology. Yes. There were damaging ideas that were untrue. And Scientology doesn't hang together. Again, you have to go and read what I've written, not just look at my face and say I smile too much. Go and check the references, and you'll find that Hubbard contradicts himself so thoroughly that you cannot trust what he's having you do. It's also true, say, in talking with one of his grandchildren, who grew up in a household with Ron Hubbard's oldest son, Ron Hubbard Jr., Nibs, and that he said that he for 7 years was the deputy, was his father deputy in Scientology, so he had quite an experience of it. And Nibs said that they'd come to a point where his dad would say, I wonder if we can get them to do this. So, for example, shouting at ashtrays. That comes about, the original bulletins were signed L. Ron Hubbard Jr. Junior was taken off them, so they look as if, which also happened with 6 of the bulletins in the OT5 material where David Mayo's name was taken off and Hubbard's was put on. That's the only change in those bulletins. I have seen both, by the way. This is not based upon conjecture or an article in Nexus magazine. So we get to this point where they're having a little bit of a problem, I think, in 1957 in an advanced clinical course, an ACC, And the students are heckling the Nibs, who's the instructor. And so his father says, work out something that will control them. And what comes out of that are TR's training routines 6 to 9, the upper indoctrination training routines, which include shouting at ashtrays. And the idea is that you are controlling people and getting them under control. So would you risk doing that? I don't think it's sensible.
My IQ went up in the first year I did Scientology. My IQ went up like 15 points. It was a tad bit above average. Then it went up to like a proper good IQ score.
So he went from having an IQ of about 100, about average, by 15 points, 115 points. We then said...
And then obviously went up even more than that. It's like a genius category.
So he's now claiming that he has an IQ of 160 or above, having gone from 100 to 115, and he's saying this is because of Scientology. Can we see the tests? And I am presuming that he's talking about Scientology's IQ testing, bearing in mind Scientology personnel are not trained in IQ testing, which you should be. And the test they use is the Otis. And it's a very old test. Otis has been dead since, he died in 1966. I looked at it yesterday. He designed the Army Alpha test, which is the very test that Stephen Jay Gould used on his graduate students, and they all were morons, basically. They were all sub the 100, which is the normal rank. So I don't believe this. I also don't think IQ tests are empirical data, as he claims here. I think, as Gould points out, they're very subjective often in their testing. So with the Army Alpha, that was used to rate people as to where immigrants should come from into the United States ever after. So the test is given in 1917-18 to all military personnel. And they found that Jews and Poles wouldn't make as good at immigrants as British people.
Yes.
We were at the top. And Scandinavians, for some reason, they came up quite high. Gould points out that many of the people that took this test didn't speak English. Some test. There were also pictures, like a wind-up gramophone, which might not be known to people coming from Romania or somewhere. So this actually limited the amount of Jews who could emigrate into America. And so it could be said that the IQ test, the Army Alpha, was responsible in part for the deaths of tens of thousands of Jews who would otherwise have been able to go to America. They never met their quota for British and Scandinavian people, so they could even have filled those in. So IQ testing, I don't think you're a genius, Andy, sorry.
He is right about the bad side of Hubbard and the insane side of Hubbard, and the dodginess about the church, and the dodginess of the tech. He also talks about, high-level tech sending people insane. You find out about the dark side of Scientology, but he really exaggerates the dark side.
I think sending people insane is pretty dark. I think the Rehabilitation Project force, where I've interviewed 2 women who were put into Rat's Alley. I talked about this with Karen Le Carrier recently, which is in the Blue Buildings in Los Angeles, and this was a hospital that had all sorts of stuff going on in it, and it's a less than 4 foot high floor that runs between the floors, where you've got cabling and pipes and things. So you're in pitch blackness. There's no lighting. They're sent in on little wheeled trolleys to scrape the grease and grit up. The place is full of rats, so it's a really terrifying experience. One of the women I interviewed was also put into the crematorium at the Blue Buildings, and this is in 1993, so years after they took the buildings over, and they still haven't cleaned them out, so they're downstats. And she finds herself put into this dark space where she finds human remains that have still not been cleaned out. Now, that's a pretty dark side. There's
barbed wire going inwards, and
it's razor wire.
Razor wire.
The fact that at Gilman Hot Springs you have, actually it points both ways. You have razor wire which prevents people from getting out. The dark side of Scientology, come on, Andy, throwing people overboard, putting a 4.5-year-old child in the chain locker, that's very dark. And so, dodginess of the tech, dodginess of the church, the insane side of Hubbard. These are things that need to be pointed out. And who was doing that before me? You know, send me a list on a postcard of who was pointing out the dodgy, dark, insane side of Hubbard. There were people. I'm in a line of succession. James Phelan is the first in 1963, Alexander Mitchell in 1968, Paulette Cooper in 1971. Lots of people looked at it, but the deep dive into what it meant, its history, the only history of Scientology, despite Janet Reitman's claims from paraphrasing sections of my work, the only real history of Scientology continues to be, let's sell these people a piece of blue sky. And I think you ought to read it, Andy.
You should do Scientology because it can improve you, but you just have to be careful. You have to not fully get sucked into it.
So you don't have to do it fully. And how can you do it if you don't do it fully? How can you do it if you don't confess all of your withholds? If you don't...
He criticises you earlier for
because I was brainwashed.
Yeah, and because you did it quickly or something like
that. Yeah, and 9 years...
And if you're not doing it completely.
Yeah, you're quick here, as he says.
Hubbard was a bit of a nutter, so be careful on those OT levels.
Yeah.
They've damaged some people.
And how are you going to know whether you're the kind of person who's going to be damaged or not?
And how do you know which bits of it are damaging if you don't watch all of our videos on Scientology? Yeah. And then you can decide.
Well, it's not the videos, the whole Getting Clear conference, my papers, Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky, Scientology, Religion of Hate, Scientology, Cult of Greed. I've done a lot of work on this. The pieces I've done about Scientology being an implanting system, a way of controlling people. Hubbard said it. We have ways of making slaves here. Yeah. And I have seen people who've been enslaved. I've interviewed, if you look at the first interview I did with Mike Rinder, there is no doubt he was enslaved. He was sent to the ship at the age of 18, having grown up in Scientology, 12 years from the age of 6. And for him, he was going to train in management so he could go back to Australia and run the management. He gets to the ship, his passport is taken away from him, and he's then told he's now going to be trained to be a deckhand. He had no choice, and the conditions were intolerable. And those conditions were overseen by Ron Hubbard. And as the Germans say, a fish stinks from the head down. So if Scientology is bad, it's him.
Study tech is awesome. The only thing wrong is that some people get obsessed with looking up words. Well,
I like to look up words, which is why I looked up Space Cowboy and Skeptic before we came to this. The study tech it's a hodgepodge, largely taken from other people's work as ever. And it can be simply expressed. You shouldn't go on too steep a gradient. You should check that you know the meaning of all words, and you should get a physical reality on anything that's abstract. That's it. There's the study tech in one paragraph.
Nice. A physical reality on anything abstract.
Yeah, so you've got some concept in your mind and you want to look at it, then put it in some physical reality. I don't agree with their demonstration kits or their clay or plasticine demos. That's not necessarily the method. But if you want to drive a tractor and you've got a book about tractors, it's a good idea to go and sit in a tractor and check it out.
Right.
You know, there you go, game, set and match, the study tech.
Yeah. I was only really involved with Scientology for like 10 years.
Now, he told me 8 years, but...
First 5 years was really heavy involvement. And honestly, it's one of the best things I've ever done. It sent me in the direction of truth.
Yeah.
And a lot of it's wrong. He says he's not a lefty.
That's
You're
me.
right-handed.
I am. He's a lefty.
I'm a lefty, yeah. I know that's not true because I can just tell by the way he approaches everything, and his beliefs line up with lefties. Doesn't even realise that he's a lefty. When I did the interviews with him...
No, we'll get on to that. Let's talk about lefties first. Yeah, I've never been a socialist, a communist, a lefty. I do believe in democracy, which I'm not sure that Andy does. As Churchill says, it's the worst form of government except for all the other forms have been tried. And I think that if authoritarianism can be changed, if people do become responsible and able to research evidence rather than going with their feelings about things, that democracy will be possible.
Yeah, you see the same problems in both systems.
Yeah, that it's authoritarianism that's destroying democracy. But I'm not a member of any group or organisation. I have never attended a left-wing political meeting. I am opposed to the right wing, to authoritarianism, to undemocratic forms. I don't believe that people are predators and prey or lefties and righties. The idea that, I have read the Communist Manifesto and I don't agree with it. So, no, your instincts on that one are also wrong, Andy.
When I did the interviews with him, he found out how I went to jail. I went to jail because I did this political thing. Yeah.
Okay, we're going to challenge that. That's a lie. I don't like to be disagreeable, but he didn't go to jail for doing a political thing. He went to jail for violating a court order saying he couldn't leave the country. And making offensive graffiti as a political statement, rather than actually writing an article and putting his views forward, putting a giant penis and testes onto a pitch, it is not a political statement. It's a way of grabbing attention. And so was this video.
Yeah, it's quite a different thing from hosting an event and holding certain beliefs to putting a giant knob on somebody's.
Yeah, it's not,
not really comparable, really.
And he does say that Scientology had taught him how to read, so he could have actually written something instead.
Yes, but he probably wouldn't have had time.
And he says,
I shouldn't have gone to jail.
Well, I hope the judges heard that.
I did the interviews with him and I was posting them on my YouTube channel and stuff, but he also was going to post them on his YouTube channel. Oh, sorry, I just want to say for that previous thing, he said it was because he didn't have time to write something. In his new video on the graffiti, he says he got the idea from his friend, so he decided to draw the knob before he made the excuse that he couldn't have written something.
Well, he stayed up all night to do the thing. I think he could have...
Yeah.
He had to travel there and back, how long does it take to write something saying, I believe that feminists shouldn't blame all men.
Yeah.
All men are potential rapists, that old chestnut. And I think most of us have got that. And understand that, in our society, feminism, up until pretty much the end of the 19th century, women were considered the property, movable property or chattels of their husband. They had no rights. You could sell your wife in the marketplace. You've got to get back and look at the history. Why has this been a problem?
Yeah.
And the idea of women being in any way intellectually inferior, I think in the last 50 years we've seen this explosion of women scientists now that they're finally allowed to go to university.
And musicians.
Yeah, I'm an equalist. I believe in equality of rights and equality of opportunities. So as to whether I did or didn't post videos, what happened, as I said, is that he cheated and put them up, put one up 3 days early, breaking his agreement with me. And Tony Ortega heard about it and wanted me to think about Andy Nolch and who he was and whether it was a good idea to do anything with him. Well, it was a bit late. I'd done 4 interviews by then, and I knew he was going to put them up. Then a couple of other people contacted me, and I've had these, don't feed the troll, don't put oxygen in the room, and I understand that. But I'm hoping that this video will have shown, elaborate and prolix, long-winded as it is, that it will have shown that it is right to discuss with people, even when I hate what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it.
Yeah.
I think that was Voltaire or somebody who'd run off to Switzerland where it was safe to defend to the death.
Yeah.
But having won the lottery. And I'm not going to defend anything to the death, I'm afraid, other than my children. So, I would not be willing to sacrifice my life to defend a principle. I'd say, yes, I believe whatever it is you want me to believe.
And then if the opportunity came to... I'd do that.
It's a false contract. It's, if somebody bullies you into something. I didn't put the videos up because people started complaining to me, and I decided that before putting them up, I needed to consider them in depth. And so the first thing I did was do an interview with Andy about his criminal record, his use of the profound hallucinogen ayahuasca, way stronger than LSD. You look at the work of John Lillian, how it sent him round the bend, frankly, taking DMT. But these are things that will be influencing him. After I'd done that interview, I was really busy. Did I say I was really busy?
Yes.
And I bounced from one treadmill of deadlines to the next, and I was sort of going, well, I really need to go through these interviews and look at them. So I then did an interview with my dear friend Eddie Stratton, with whom there's also a video about Holocaust denial, and said to him, is it right to talk with people who disagree with you? If I think somebody's a neo-Nazi, should I talk with them? I believe I should.
Yes, absolutely.
And see if I can change their mind. I'll give an example. I had a conversation one evening with a guy who was in the military, and he said he hadn't talked to his sister for 2 years because she was a druggie. And I said, what drug? Expecting heroin, cocaine, something like that. He said cannabis. So we sat, and while he drank 5 single malt whiskies, each a different type, and I drank 5 orange juices, we talked about drugs. And the upshot was that the next day he found his sister.
Yeah.
Now, I could have taken the view, I think your view is ridiculous, I'm not talking to you, the cancel culture, but I don't.
When he found out that I was controversial, he was then suddenly like, well, I don't know if I want to put him on my channel while we're doing this.
Yep. So he's right, I didn't put you on the channel, Andy. I've been busy, I was getting to it. I got thrown into writing a book proposal. Where are we? We did the interviews in March. I finished the book I was working on in May, and then was checked into this book proposal, which has meant I've had to read 16 books about all sorts of, and watch 40 hours of video, and so just haven't had the time to do this. It's actually taken several hours just to prepare this, to go carefully through what you said and rebut it.
Talking about you, I don't know if you believe in freedom of speech because you seem like a lefty, like totally, and lefties always for censorship. They call everything hate speech and they just love censorship.
We haven't censored a single word of what you said, Andy.
Yeah, we're quoting from it. He's not for freedom of speech, he's totally for censorship.
Haven't censored anything, Andy.
I was totally going along with him and stuff. I was agreeing with him on points.
Yeah. And here we have, again, this conflict of being passive-aggressive, that he was going along with me and he was agreeing with me. So I didn't, these points, and as I say, we've only had 3 points, which could have been said in 3 or 4 minutes, and we have an hour and 20 minutes of video.
It's a shifty leftist.
I'm a shifty leftist.
He sent me emails, like a picture of a flower would come up on the emails, and it was really weird because it was like, what the hell? But it's the same as him constantly smiling, right?
I do smile a lot. I apologise. And I'm a photographer. I'm an artist and don't actually do that kind of thing in college. And I take photos. And for years I've stuck these photos, which are often usually of my own garden and flowers in the garden, things in the garden. It seems to me a friendly way. It's like a greetings card by email.
Yeah.
But I'm sorry to have offended you. I'm not really sure how.
Can you smile that a bit more when you say that? He sent me like a flower, like a star, and it's this passive aggressive thing. I send people pictures of flowers and
birthday cards.
Emails. Yeah,
passive
exactly.
Aggressive. We're just getting weird here.
I'd probably stay away from his stuff.
Yeah. because it's best to censor things.
Yes. Okay.
And now we're going to get into something that sounds somewhat homophobic,
Yes.
having been anti-Semitic and racist and and misogynistic. We're now going to get into his view of gay people.
Let's say you're suspicious that your boss is gay, right? I could work at the place and I could see him listen to like George Michael pop songs. God. And I could see like a little bit of foundation on his cheeks. And then I could see him walk down the streets with his hand over another man's hand. And I'll be like, hey guys, our boss is gay. And I'll do a YouTube.
Now, why do you have to
He's
do a
gay.
YouTube about your boss being gay? You know, that you're just weird.
I mean, I'm not 100% sure, but he's gay. Come on, I do a YouTube saying that. If he sends you pictures of flowers, then he's most definitely
I left it.
Jon Atack. If he was working there, he would literally need to walk in on the boss having sex with another man, and then John would go, okay, the boss is gay.
But I wouldn't make a YouTube about it.
No.
And the other way of finding out would be for him to tell me.
Yes.
And, I couldn't care less because I'm not homophobic. So this is, we are getting into the dark side of Andy Nolch. And here we go.
Dark side.
This is the point of this video for those of you who've managed to endure this much. Here we have the point. We told you we'd get to it eventually.
There's a thing called circumstantial evidence, and that's basically like weak evidence, right? He cannot deal with weak evidence. He needs hardcore, proper smoking gun evidence, which is what we've done here. Sometimes you just don't have smoking gun evidence when it comes to things like JFK assassination, and you need to watch a movie about it.
Yeah, to tell you the truth.
I agree, I haven't seen any smoking gun evidence for aliens.
But
They're flying around, they're abducting people, they've had meetings with the government, they're working in secret underground bases. Very nice.
only circumstantial evidence for it. But some skeptics need full-on hardcore truth.
Yes.
Well, yeah, I do. I've seen enough deconstructions of weak circumstantial evidence not to follow it. And
Yeah, if there's weak evidence, it's
weak.
You test it, and then you find out whether it's true or not. And if it's potentially harmful, you wait till you have stronger evidence.
Just as Andrew Wakefield was offered a full
Gold standard study. Yes.
and refused it because non-skeptics, or what should we call them, gullible people, credulous people, naive people, there are various words in the language, people who don't need evidence are easily convinced, and they're convinced emotionally, and that's how they get involved with cult groups. That's how authoritarian cults develop, because somebody comes along and says, did you know that our ancestors lived in Atlantis and they had superpowers, electron powers, and they then miscegenated, they interbred with the people of Lemuria, and that's why the Germans don't have superpowers.
Yes.
This is a real story. This is the Madame Blavatsky, and this was taken by the people who called themselves Ariosophists or Theozoologians, and made up, there are only two guys involved in this, made up the nonsensical Aryan race theory. Most neo-Nazis are completely unaware of this story.
Yeah.
But this is the origin, so you look for harder evidence. As to a lot of circumstantial evidence adding up to real evidence, no, it doesn't. Let's look to the gay example. He listens to George Michael. Well, you can listen to Barbara Streisand and Judy Garland as well. Doesn't mean anything much to me. He puts foundation on, well, when I've been in TV studios, I've had that happen to me. And he holds hands with another guy. Well, if he's an Arab, that's a part of their culture. It's normal to walk down the street holding hand with another guy. But I'm still going, so this is circumstantial evidence, and I'm not going to go out and shout to the world, he's gay.
I mean, if he dresses like a metro.
Yeah, which Andy does tend to do. If he has a kind of delicate manner, which Andy does tend to have, and if he's passive-aggressive, which is to say he's claiming to be like Jesus and Buddha in how chilled out he is. But this is about rage.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I need truth. I don't need weak evidence.
Jon is just like that. He needs a friend who is a conspiracy theorist to keep on encouraging him.
To wake me up. Now, You're too late. I have a friend I've had for nearly 38 years now who doesn't like being called a conspiracy theorist, but he, has read a fair amount of David Icke. He watches James Corbett. And over the years, we've had many conversations about 9/11, about the moon landings, about whatever. And he's presented me with aspects of evidence. I watched James Corbett on the idea that Bill Gates is trying to murder most of the population of the world with vaccines,
which have chips in them. Yeah.
Or put a laser print. And this idea, when you go off and research it, rather than just being in an echo chamber, which I fear is a bit of a problem here, where you look at material that comes. So I've watched James Corbett. I haven't read David Icke. I think he's an idiot. And he admitted that this drug ayahuasca that Andy's keen on, that's what led him to believe that the British royal family were transdimensional lizards, which he completely denies now. He says that was wrong, it was a hallucination. He also said of one of his books that 3 weeks before it was published, he got new information, didn't have time to check it, so just put it in. That's not good enough. But I do have a friend who believes in such things, and we have conversations and we agree about some conspiracies, like Coca-Cola and the funding of the Nazis. But we don't agree that Hitler and Lenin were both British agents, which he said, or various other things. So the encouragement has failed, I'm afraid. Man continues to be a good friend, having said that.
Oh, there's the thing about the oranges again. This guy's just right. Zeitgeist is a fantastic conspiracy documentary. It just literally tells you the truth.
Truth comes from primary documents. It comes from interviewing witnesses and checking witness accounts. In researching Scientology, I took material from 150 people. A fair amount of it court testimony under oath, government reports, little bits and pieces. Mainly Hubbard himself, but what you're looking for is consistency. So the fact, for example, we would say, yes, Hubbard was involved in a 55-hour battle against a magnetic deposit off the Oregon coast.
Yeah, who won? Who won? Him or the magnetic deposit?
The magnetic deposit.
Yes.
And he basically, Admiral Braisted, in his report on that, according to Prouty's sheep-dipped file, says he must never have independent command again. He, after that, went down and shelled some Mexican islands, which thankfully were uninhabited. But you then go consistency. Okay, Admiral Braisted. Braisted is mentioned in Hubbard's private papers in, I think it's 1947, in the affirmations, where he gives his name. So this shows that Braisted was there. Okay. When you go to the Armstrong trial, a man called Thomas Moulton gave evidence he was Hubbard's second in command on that boat. And you piece together the pieces of evidence. Occasionally, Hubbard did tell the truth, and it will fit in. So I think we've been through... there's a letter to the FBI, 7th of September 1955, where Hubbard says he has forwarded material on brainwashing technologies to the Defence Department. And I basically found the reference to where that is in the Library of Congress. So the primary document, Hubbard's letter, could be seen. He could also, in fact, go to the FBI and make a Freedom of Information request, which is what I did. And he'd get Hubbard's letters to the FBI, one of which an FBI agent has written, appears mental, because he was saying all of the people he didn't like were communists. And the quote I gave earlier, and we're near the end now if you're feeling exhausted, because I certainly am. Hubbard claimed that he could brainwash faster than the Russians, 20 seconds to total amnesia. That's in Technical Bulletin of the 22nd of July 1956. So, and he wanted to charge $25 an hour for his conditioning of astronauts in 1961, I think it was, which was quite a lot of money. And talked about having been offered Pavlov's laboratories by the Russians, which was not in fact true. So, and he said that his letter was, said in the early 1940s, a lonely letter wandered into the White House, uninvited, unannounced. It was brief, it was factual, and it gave America the deciding edge in arms superiority. Its subject was the atom bomb, and its signature was Professor Albert Einstein. This is another such letter. So, no false modesty there. So, Andy, we'd like you to have a gene test to see what race you belong to. Yep. We'd like to have an IQ test to demonstrate that you're a genius. We'd like you to read Brian Deere's book about Andrew Wakefield, and point out that Andrew Wakefield was not anti-vax again. He actually had patented his own vaccine for measles, which we doubt would have been effective. So, you know,
and listen to some George Michael and see if it turns you gay.
Yeah, and hold hands with a bloke and see if that turns you gay. And maybe that's the problem. Yeah. Maybe, you know, if you could come out of the closet and the secret briefings, we'd find out who you really are. And this probably has, in places, sounded sarcastic. I apologise for that. But
and when somebody's attacking you again and again, it can be...
It gets a bit tedious.
Yes.
You know, repeatedly being told you're untrustworthy, and you haven't actually given any evidence, not a scrap of evidence, to debunk me or show that my work shouldn't be considered by people. So get out there and do it, Andy.
And whereas you got you on a slight mistake on the President Kennedy letter, we've debunked quite a lot of ideas here.
Yes.
To suggest that you should be sceptical of Nolch's work.
Yes. So by all means, look at it as an example of what it is.
Yes.
Closed door, secret briefings on the internet.
Oranges.
Oranges are not the only fruit. And God, I'm absolutely tired out. I thought this was going to be fun.
It was.
But it was, I'm glad somebody
enjoyed it.
Grueling. So, and the horror is that we're now going to have to put up all 4 of the interviews with Andy Nolch, so you can come and see them here. Don't have to go to Australia to see them. And also my conversation with Eddie about whether we should try and enter into dialogue. And let me say, when I first heard about this, I was about to email Andy and say, well, just ask me the questions and we'll do it. You don't have to be passive aggressive.
Yeah.
But when I saw what he'd actually said about me, I realised it was just a ramble and a meander. Yeah. So there we are. You have been responded to, and over to you, Andy.
Your turn.
Thank you so much. I'm Jon Atack.
I'm Sam Atack.
And I'm weary. So go out and buy 10 copies of Opening Our Minds immediately. Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Goodbye.
Thanks.
Hi, Jon here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.